destroy Katanga. William Gibson, formerly at the Vietnam desk in the American Embassy in Paris, was made U.S. consul in Angola, where irate Portuguese threw his car in the river in July 1961. Charles Yost, formerly U.S. charged affairs in Laos, became ambassador to Morocco in time to turn America's great, French-owned, airbase there over to the Moroccans. From Morocco, Yost went home to become Adlai Stevenson's assistant at United Nations. Leland Barrows, our Saigon EK chief through the crucial years, was named ambassador to the Camerons. And Michigan State University, its Vietnam project, police training and propaganda producing for the NGO Din suddenly terminated, embarked on an African project, ushered in by a morning parade for the communist Lumumba. Angier Biddle-Duke became Kennedy's chief of protocol, and as his first official act, swore in Foreign Aid for Africa chief, Henri Labuisse. Labuisse, the former Eve Curie, told newsmen she was no longer interested in nuclear science, but would make her husband's work her work, Aid for Africa. Only dull. As investments, our hard-headed forebears might call the above gilt-edged. The dividends for first Russia and then Peking have been immense. Chapter 19. The Chain Reaction. Thoughtful American lawmakers acted long ago to prevent private citizens from entering into relations with heads of foreign states and dabbling in diplomacy. The extent to which crusading Americans, who should have been minding their business within America, intruded in fields where their qualifications were nil is illustrated by an incident that took place in early 1957. The Hungarian Revolt, as we have stated, provided an excellent opportunity for socialists of the Budinger ilk to circumvent existing immigration laws. Large batches of foreign nationals who were unlikely, according to Mr. Ahrens of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, ever to cast a conservative vote were rammed through the immigration barriers, while the headlines were hot. As 1956 ended, This Week magazine carried a number of articles signed by Mr. Budinger's friend, Leo Kame, that were undeniably propaganda for the operation designed to flood America with refugees. Following the article, published December 30th, 1956, Mr. Kame was asked, "How can one direct a rescue committee and plead for funds to help men escape communist tyranny, and at the same time sit on the executive committee that fights, with its ears closed to every unpleasant report, to maintain a family clique that can match every political prisoner in Budapest with an anti-communist patriot languishing in concentration camps in South Vietnam? Man, wow, American people who have depended upon your association for the honest reports and new written letters to their senators advocating support of the policies your executive committee recommended cannot be put on off forever with land assurances that the unpleasant rumblings emanating from South Vietnam are due to French propaganda and Franco-British intrigue. At this instant, President Diem is putting the final touches to his new accord with France and, through Buhoy, negotiating a similar one with Ho Chi Minh, preparing, as his relations with Washington deteriorated, to play France and Ho against America. These things are going to prove embarrassing someday. Believe me, sir, when the American friends of Vietnam which was organized to aid a people fighting with their backs to the sea, becomes a propaganda machine for a man and his hated family. There must be an inevitable shadow cast over everything done thereafter by that association's directing committee members. Short, memoried as the American public is, I cannot help but believe that the Rescue Committee's bed partner, American Friends of Vietnam, will someday cause the committee a loss of prestige at the time when some future revolt will make its work needed most. No. Chimy's reply of January 16, 1957, was arrogantly condescending. I doubt that anything I would tell you concerning my admiration for President Diem and the effective nature of his government and his people's resistance to communism would alter your point of view, he wrote. What did Chirac really know about Diem? The answer is nothing. He was off on a dime kick, which he termed admiration, closing his eyes to every aspect of the Diem regime but the refugee influx, in which Diem himself was passive. Chimay repeated the threadbare refrain, if a president and a government which have given sanctuary to 1 million people who fled from communism can be called freedom, extinguishing, then by that logic I would expect you to say that Ho Chi Minh carries the torch of freedom. None be mine. Snide insolence or no reply at all was the answer every man who knew what was going on received from the small clique making Vietnam their business. As head of the Research Institute of America, Mr. Chern delivered a lecture in Los Angeles in 1956, at which time he met Mrs. Doris Parks, wife of a prominent attorney. Mrs. Parks drew the director of Diem's American lobby out on a limb. In a letter to Mr. Chern, she asked if it were true that President Diem was holding the wives and children of anti-communist nationalist leaders as hostages. Chimay hotly denied the allegation, whereupon Mrs. Parks expressed pleasure and told him that in that case she was sure Madame Nguyen Ton Hoan and her children, currently being held as hostages, would be given a passport and be permitted to join Dr. Hoan in Paris. Chimay stalled for time while he talked it over with the lobby. On December 18, 1956, he wrote to Mrs. Parks, your letter is far too important for me to rush an uninformed reply. You can. What? Sure. That. Neither I nor any of U.S. who are associated with the C. International Rescue Committee or the American Friends of Vietnam would in the slightest measure be you indifferent to any diminution of your freedom in a Vietnam or anywhere else. For that matter, I will seek to enlarge my information and will write to you just as soon as I am able. But Mrs. Parks was not to be put off. She stated that she was not as charitable toward Mr. Bottinger, Mr. Cheen's fellow member of the executive committee of the Dime Lobby, as Mr. Chern was. She wanted me, Hoan and her children liberated, and at once, she continued, on December 28, in a letter to Mr. Kim. In personal contact with Dr. Hoan, one thing shines like a light. He is completely honest in his dedication to his country and the cause of freedom. Contrast this with the smooth rationalization Press. Diem handed out to Freda Utley, and which she reported to the U.S. through an article for National Review, Novara Pi. 24, 1956, of the necessity for dictatorship and political prisons that democratic institutions in South Vietnam can be protected and saved. What nonsense if it were not such a tragedy? How can Mr. Buttinger have spent hours with a man of Dr. Hohn's rare intelligence and dedication, heard his story, and then go right on directing and participating in a delusion of the American public about NGO Din Diem? Friends of mine in the Philippines are quite positive that Mr. Buttinger was one of the last visiting Americans that Dr. Hohn's Viet nationalists risked arrest for by daring to pour out their story to him. What did he do about their story? Where was it reported? With passionate awareness of America's opportunity to assist the cause of freedom in today's dark world with deeds, not just a mountain of expressed lofty sentiment, I am sure you want substance back of your words I quoted at the beginning of this letter. Well, Dr. Hohn's Christmas card from Paris stares back at me. Minda. Hohen and his children are still being held in South Vietnam sans passport. You see. Backed in a cummer, the man whose heart bled for the Hungarians replied in an outburst of anger on January 2, 1957, when forced to look at realities in Vietnam, under the man whose stranglehold on the country, Mr. Sharon and his friends had made their business. Dear Mrs. Parks, your second letter is so strikingly different in attitude and objectivity from your first that I cannot fail to comment upon it. I said I would move to secure the facts. I also tried to state my own political and philosophical formulation before finding out whether or not you would have any reason to have confidence in my judgment or reason to have faith in my democratic commitment. You have now proceeded to lecture me. You also find you cannot accept my statement at face value. I wonder, then, why you took the trouble to write to me. I certainly must have been equally suspect before. I have no doubt you knew before that I was a member of American Friends of Vietnam. Though a member of its executive committee, I have not participated in the deliberations of that committee except on rare occasions because of my rather complete preoccupation with the problems of the International Rescue Committee. You then proceed to evaluate Mr. Buttinger for me. I know Mr. Buttinger well. Well, I have for some years. I wonder whether you have ever met him. I plan to ask him this question when he returns from Vienna, where he went on entirely his own expense to function as European Director of Hungarian Relief for IRK. There are few men in the world whose consistent democratic convictions, courage in political action, and dedication to free values, in my judgment, I respect more than Mr. Buttinger. Buttinger, if you have not met Mr. Buttinger, it might help to explain to you why Dr. Hohn, of whom you write, speaks so highly of him. Quite candidly, I have no further intention of further debating this matter of Vietnam with you. I do have intention, however, of ascertaining the facts and guiding my actions accordingly. I am sorry I have had reason to disappoint you in the past. You might have waited to find out whether that reason proved unjustified in this instance, or, provided that you had, saved us both time. Sincerely, Leo Kime. 2 weeks later, Ngo Dinh Diem sent for Amamol Hohn in Saigon and told her that she could leave the country when she wished. All of this roundabout pressure and exchange of letters to force an act of common decency. When Leo Kim's admiration for President Diem, which he saw no point in trying to explain to ignorant dolts who had studied the Indochina scene for many years, abated, we do not know. Joseph Buttinger must have begun to have doubts, for when the 463-page Vietnam book he mentioned in his famous 1955 letter finally appeared, in early 1958, he disposed of the whole dime period with 6 innocuous pages. In a letter written to Dr. Hohn on February 10, 1958, Buttinger forestalled unfavorable observations by Vietnamese able and likely to expose him by encouraging them to hope that someday he might mobilize American support for it. His failure to make any criticism of the Diem regime, he told Dr. Pawan, was because I know too little about it. This from the man who had lobbied for said regime, silenced its critics, and as he himself had promised Diem in the letter we have quoted, worked to keep American opinion and policy behind it. The book itself, entitled The Smaller Dragon, and published by Prager, was a hodgepodge of material Mr. Buttinger had collected on Vietnam's long-past rulers and gleaned of everything favorable to the socialist, anti-colonialist thesis. What emerged was a sort of Jean-Jacques Rousseau glorification of the unspoiled native. Kings, according to socialist dialects, one gathered, were good if long dead and victims of European superior armament, and only bad if alive, and posing the problems of legitimacy. The most glowing review and praise of the author was Leo Keem's full page in the New Leader of May 12, 1958. This time, Mr. Keem wrote as the director of the Research Institute of America, in no way connected with Mr. Joseph Buttinger. Just 1 year before the Buttinger book appeared, the Die Viet Party had compiled a white book on the graft, corruption and police state methods current under Diem and his brothers. Dr. Ho Han, then without funds in Paris, scraped together enough money among his fellow party members in exile to send copies to Joseph Buttinger, General O'Daniel, Ngir Biddledew, Leo Keem and other authorities on South Vietnam, then sitting at the head tables of Diem banquets, all for Diem banquets. So hungry were the men who had made South Vietnam their avocation for information on the subject that every one of them refused to accept delivery of the book. By 1957, it was no longer a matter of simply changing presidents. The family was riding a tiger. Opposition had been crushed too brutally for too long. Pressures had been built up. Disapproval had given way to hatred. As the hatred increased within the country, Father Patrick O'Connor and Father de Jayer had to use the weight of their great authority to increase counter-pressure from without. Their man simply must not fall, for the time was past when Diem's removal could be effected without violence. The church, the cloth, the weight of the words of Diem's friends as priests were brought into play to save him. Guests of the NGO Dins, who would go home and plead their cause, poured through Saigon. All parroted the claim that no matter what the family did, we must stick by them because they were fighting communism. They were not. Instead, they were fighting for their monopoly on a country, with the communist threat as a talking point. Joseph Nerbonne, of the Los Angeles Times, told his readers on May 5, 1957, gradually Diem whittled away the strength of his opponents, soundly beating most, persuading some to come over to his side, buying off others, and by degrees winning the admiration of the majority of suspicious Vietnamese south of the 17th parallel. Though the long war of the Reds was proceeding smoothly, with one village after another passing under complete Red control at night and night, by agreement with the Viet Minh, presenting the surface calm of government control by day, Nerbonne wrote, and the Serenity Los Angeles Times printed the statement that one of the most impressive achievements of Diem since taking office is the restoration of security in a country physically broken by Japanese occupation and 8 years of civil war. It del was segdeun as dishonest as Cabot Lodge's assertion in 1963 that Vietnam's down spiral is ended. Daily, inexorably, the rotting at the base continued. On January 2, 1958, a band described by the press as pirate attacked a rubber plantation 47 miles from Saigon and made off with a payroll of $1.5 million piastre, taking a representative of the Saigon government with them. The pirates were members of the Cao Dai sect, which the American papers daily assured their readers had been destroyed and were never heard of anymore. For a time, about a year after Mamie Hone and her three been permitted to leave the country, it looked as though a change of attitude might be taking place in Washington. A Vietnamese teenager wrote a letter to Alfred Friendly, editor of the Washington Post, which Mr. Friendly put on the Post's front page of February 25, 1958. When one considers the following letter, one can appreciate the encouragement it gave the Vietnamese opposition that the Washington Post should print it. Dear Mr. Friendly, I am a little Vietnamese girl. I saw your name in a newspaper and decided to write to you because your name sounded the nicest. Here are some questions I would like to know about America. For now, Vietnamese people are living under the help of your country. I would also like to let you know what I think about America. These questions are my doubts towards your country. If you answer my questions, I am sure that all the other Vietnamese will appreciate it. 1. Ho's American government help Vietnamese people because of these principal reasons. A commercial point of view, Vietnam will be a big market for the commerce and industry of America. But strategic point of view, Vietnam will be used to stop communism. 2. Is it right that the policy of the American government is to assimilate all the countries living under its help? 3. Will Americans go home soon or will they stay in Vietnam for 100 years? 4. Do American people know that Ngo Dinh Diem is an American puppet, as some ought the Vietnamese think? 5. Do American people know that 95% of Vietnamese people don't like them? Friendly, I found that although we live under the help of Americans, but we don't like Americans, we don't get along with Americans. 6. What do Americans think about Vietnamese people? Do they consider us as Negroes in America? 7. Is President Eisenhower influenced by big capitalists, such as General Motors, General Electric, or other interests? 8. Why are there still a lot of white Americans do not get along with black Americans? Do they still have the impression that black, sick Americans are their slaves? I think America is a democratic and free country, so such a colored separation must be ended. The trouble at Little Rock, do you think that was a big shame hung over America? 9. What do Americans think about the Russian man-made moon and 150 atomic submarine? I think that's a big mortification for American government. 10. Do you agree with me that Americans do not have man-made moon because American spies could not work in Russia? Russians control their country very rigid. 11. How can Hollywood make James more popular than President Eisenhower in Vietnam? If America is really a democratic country, I am sure that your government will let you answer all of my questions. Sincerely yours, and thanks. Miss Lemine, pseudonym. What happened to this Miss Lemine? No one ever asked. An avalanche of letters from anti-Diem Vietnamese descended on Mr. B. Friendly till over the grapevine went the word, no more letters to Friendly. They are being turned over to CIL. Shame. Under his Research Institute of America Identity, addressed a New York conference on investment conditions in Vietnam, and managed to work in a reply to Miss which Mary Hornaday, staff correspondent of the Christian Science Monitor, reported in the Monitor of March 3, 1958. On October 30, 1958, a New York Times editorial proclaimed with all pompous dignity of the Times, 3 years ago, chances for success in this beleaguered country seemed small. Strong leadership and wisely given help tipped the scale. President Theodin Diem attacked the Goa dissidents frontally and defeated them. He set up truly representative government, in itself no small gamble, and derived his authority, which is great, from the will of the people. Out in the villages, the government showed how it was possible to beat the communists on their own ground. Oh, what of this authority and these victories? The liberal in Times Square in New York thought he could make a reality simply by continually telling us they exist. Authorities smugly described as coming from the people. Through the summer of 1959, approved candidates campaigned for the National Assembly elections due to take place on August 30th. Phan Quang Dan and an independent named Nguyen Tran announced their candidacy. Press censorship prevented Saigon papers from speaking of them. Diem's special powers law denied them the right to address assemblies of more than 5 people. If their supporters tried to put up posters, they were arrested. Every inch of wall and billboard space was reserved for Diem's hand-picked candidates. Because supporters of Dan and Nguyen Tran had been arrested for putting up election posters, it was said, over posters of the opponents, condemnations were filed against their chiefs. Despite all these handicaps, Dan, running under the banner of his Free Democrat Party, got 10,000 votes more than the next highest vote-getter on the ticket. He and Nguyen Tran were both elected. Diem disqualified them under his rubber stamp law that men with condemnations against them were ineligible for office. Dan entered the assembly anyway and demanded his seat, since he had received 33,166 votes against the government candidate's 6,700. 2 of Diem's police came in and forcibly threw him out. No word of this, however, appeared in Time magazine's September 14, 1959, report on South Vietnam's election. Through the long summer of 1960, a sullen resentment gripped the country. The country's feelings had been expressed in the August 30, 1959, elections. Diem's contempt for the country's wishes was made clear when his policemen forcibly hustled Phan Quang Dan out of the assembly. The conclusions to the people were obvious. Things might have dragged on indefinitely. However, with no more than a latent, growing feeling among the masses that life could not be much worse under Ho Chi Minh, had 3 crack battalions from General Giap, Elite 325th Division, trained at Gia Lam near Hanoi, not erupted on the scene in mid-October to show their strength. It started at 30 a.m. on October 21, 1960, in the darkness surrounding a guard post near Man Bac, about 100 miles north of Kontum in the high plateau region of the Montagnard tribes. The post had been set up to protect a supply base for one of the grandiose projects being pushed under American aid. It was a new road, a prolongation of Route 14 to join Kontum with Quang Nam. 2 battalions surged out of the night in the initial attack. They blew up part of the defenses, destroyed trucks, bulldozers, and other road-building equipment estimated at around $5.70 million. Most of the workmen were killed. Only one small post defended by civil guards and a small unit of the National Army held out. Knowing the ruses of the Viet Minh, many later agreed that the post may have been permitted to survive. The attackers knew its defenders would radio frantically for support, which they did. 2 of the attacking battalions installed themselves in positions they had seized, while a third set up an ambush along the road to await the relief call. After 4 o'clock in the afternoon it came, weighted down with trucks and tanks, repairing sabotaged stretches of the road along the way. The Viet Minh, Viet Cong, battalions forming a regular Ho Chi Minh regiment were superbly armed with the most modem weapons, superior if anything to the equipment of the National Army. The furious combat that ensued lasted for several days, on terrain that was ideal for the communists. Diem's heavy, impeccable, spit and polish army was not prepared for it. For the first time, Giappa's real striking force was unleashed to fight as an army. It was his warning that the change from long war to short campaign could and might come at any time. As more national troops were flown north to counter the offensive, Viet Minh regiments appeared from nowhere. Not 3 battalions, but a Viet Minh division, supported by the local population, had moved in with all its equipment: flares, bazookas, heavy mortars. Captured material proved to be French and American. When the battle was over, the Reds leisurely withdrew to their bases in Laos, taking with them what they could, destroying what was left. With a jolt, the Vietnamese army took stock of its losses. From the balance sheet, a painful truth stood out. They had been decimated because the people of the countryside had acted as the eyes and ears of the enemy. Officers faced the obvious lesson and reacted accordingly. There was more to soldiering than supporting a man on whose tenure in office the army's pay depended. If there were going to be any more contumes because of hatred of the man on whom the Americans made the army's pay contingent, better to have a showdown over pay than be cut to pieces. The Contuma battle can be said to have dual touch to off the chain reaction that in 3 years ended in the crumbling of everything America had built up in 9 years. The cost of billions of dollars and more lives by than dingle. American mothers have feet, even been told. The world did not know what had happened. The censorship lid on Washington, as well as Saigon, was just as tight. But the Vietnamese army knew, and in less than 2 weeks after the Kontum battle ended, the army stirred. In the heavy air of a tropical morning, just before dawn broke over Saigon on November 11, 1960, parachutists in rubber-soled shoes and camouflaged nylon combat uniforms surrounded the palace where Diem slept. For 36 hours, Diem's fate hung in the balance. Through duplicity, bluffing, lying, and stalling for time, he won, and once more the lead weight of an ever-present but intangible menace hung over the city. Men spoke in low voices again, looking carefully around before expressing themselves. Over 150 were wounded, some 30 killed. Diem survived, but America had her warning. Chapter 20. Prelude to the End. The events of Friday, November 11, 1960, and the day that followed were to color everything that happened thereafter, and ultimately to create an unbridgeable gulf of suspicion between officers whose first aim should have remained the salvation of their country. The big opportunity came when Diem, fearing a general Viet Cong offensive, put the 3 battalions of parachutists surrounding the capital as security forces under the operational command of the army. Until then, their every movement had been watched and controlled from the palace. Colonel Nguyen Chan Thi, commander of the troops in question, had a healthy respect for Un Hu's secret police, but his adjutant, Lieutenant Vuong Van Dong, had been waiting for just such an opportunity. Dong's uncle, the lawyer Hong Ko Thui, was a friend of Phan Quang Dan and Deputy Phan Kok Su, and Phan Kok Su had incurred Diem's displeasure by accusing the government of corruption, oppression, undemocratic elections, despotism, favoritism in army appointments, gross inefficiency in administration, and nepotism in business. In a 7-page manifesto signed by 15 deputies, Phan Kok Su and his Progress and Liberty Party had demanded government reforms on May 1, 1960. Diem ignored them. So at 3:00 a.m. on November 11, carrying his colonel with him, Lieutenant Colonel Dong profited by their temporary freedom of movement to occupy strategic points of the city. The barracks of the Presidential Guard, near Diem's subterranean dungeons and torture cells in the Botanical Gardens, were taken by assault. According to statements made later by Dong and his fellow officers, they would have seized the presidential palace without a shot if at the last moment, they had not been betrayed by an ambitious armored car officer who, taking that road to sure promotion, alerted the palace guard just before the paratroopers arrived there. Diem barely had time to take shelter in the bunker he had prepared for just such an emergency. Outside, the police had joined the rebels. Dong wanted to storm the palace at once. Others wanted to wait for heavier armament. Colonel Lee was for negotiating, and this was their downfall. In his extremity, Diem remembered the time tried counsel given by his American advisors in the spring of 1955 when he faced the forces of the BMH Xuyen, the COD and Hoa sects, the masses of the Dai Viet Party and beyond them, all the country. Invite negotiations. Play for time. He had been told. Time, April 4th, 1955. In other words, promise your countrymen anything until their guard is down, then knife them. General McGarr was American commander of the advisory group at the time of the pre-dawn revolt of November 11.96, and McGarr was at a loss. He temporized. Washington was in the throes of an election, and in the absence of orders to jump one way or the other, General McGarr followed the Oriental maxim which warns, to make no mistake, do nothing. He urged Dong and the group opting for action to try to reach an understanding with Diem. Accordingly, old General J.L.E. Ventai, the chief of staff who had been Diem's tool since September 1954, when the army was threatened with no American aid and hence no pay if it did not desert General Hin, was brought forward to act as emissary. Tai had been arrested when the paratroopers moved on the palace. Colonel Lee and Lieutenant Colonel Dong, as heads of the military committee and president of the provisional government, respectively, empowered General Tai to promise Diem their cooperation. Diem would not be forced from power. All they demanded was that New and his wife be sent elsewhere. Diem pretended to negotiate. He made objections, requested time to consider certain points, and promised that his reply would be delivered that evening. Meanwhile, from his shortwave post in the palace anchor went a stream of calls for loyal troops to move on the capital. Above all, Diem and New were trying to contact Diem's godson, Colonel Tran Thien Kim, who was with the 21st Division in Mythos south of Saigon. The press at the time referred to Colonel Kim as Diem's nephew. He was not a nephew, but Diem had held him at the baptismal fount, and on arrival in power, he had pushed Kim ahead among his favorites. The city delirious crowds were pulling down Diem's pictures from public buildings and burning Madame New in effigy. Out a heavy atmosphere of indecision was discernible. A wary foreboding pervaded the city. A feeling that it was too good to be true. That secret police were watching, and that if, in the end, the brothers besieged in the palace were to come out victors, it would go hard with anyone manifesting too much joy in the brief period of liberty. A Vietnamese named Ha Van Tran provided the Associated Press with such on-the-spot news as AP passed on to the American public. Ha, who had seen priests go to jail for doubting Diem's popularity, prudently stuck to a line that had never failed to please the Americans, and which would not cost him his neck if Diem and New came out on top. Ha told America via AP on November 11th that a military revolutionary committee said it had overthrown the government of President Ngo Dinh Diem. The fate of the Catholic, staunchly anti-communist chief executive was not immediately known. At least 15 paratroopers were reported killed in fighting around the presidential palace in the heart of the capital, where the ruling French colonialists of Indochina once sat, the real villains. If one wanted to be on the safe side, were still the French. By mid Afternoon, members of NU's Republican Youth Movement were in the streets and quarters unoccupied by the paratroopers, distributing hastily printed tracts announcing that officers leading the revolt had been bought by the communists and the colonialists. It is the habit of the Diem government to baptize as Vietnamese all opposers of the regime, Jean Lartigue wrote in Paris Press of November 15. No one accepted the story that the and Dong, both noted for their patriotism and anti-communist sentiments, had sold out to the enemy. New then changed the charge to incitement by the Americans, with the French colonialists perhaps having a hand in it. Saigon USIS Chief and Inspector was the American on whom Nguyen Diem, Secretary of State for the presidency, were setting their sights. All afternoon that Saturday of November 11, the desperate radio calls from the bunker continued. To gain time, Diem agreed to a list of reforms, civil liberties, free elections, a new economic program, more effective measures against the communists, and the elimination of the NUS from any hand in government. It looked as though the colonels had won. Phan Quang Dan and the civilian opposition emerged from their hideouts and gathered around a microphone to announce their support of the revolt, while Dong prepared to storm the palace. Someone persuaded him to wait till the next day. By Saturday morning, Diem's personal troops of the 7th Division had reached Bien Hoa, less than 20 miles from Saigon, and 11 tanks commanded by his godson Kim were rolling on the city. A unit of Vietnamese Marines sensed that Dien Dong had waited too long and agreed to bring the rescuing troops in by boat, past the roadblocks and demolished bridges. Since 8 that morning, the crowd had been demonstrating around the palace, bearing placards inscribed, "Down with Ngo Dinh Diem and his family." Still, Dong did not move. Around 10 p.m. Kim arrived with his tanks, embraced his fellow officers, and swore that he was with them. To Colonel They, he confided that a circle of tanks around the palace would not only assure the success of their assault, but guarantee the safety of Diem should a popular uprising get out of control. I trusted him completely. But Kim was only following instructions he had received from the palace to stall for time until the infantry could arrive from Bien Hoa. Then the gun turrets of his tanks were slowly turned on his comrades. From the palace, the presidential guard began firing into the crowd. How many were killed is not known for sure. It was estimated that as many as 400 paratroopers died before the affair was over. Then the purge of the army and arrests of civilians started. Demonstrations were set up to convince the Americans that the people were still behind Diem. A mass was held in Saigon's cathedral for the recovery of peace. Demonstrators mobilized from labor unions, the National Assembly, the National Revolutionary League, and news youth groups went out with their banners, and South Vietnam was almost back where it had been. But not quite. If Diem had emerged with his ego and obstinacy unscathed, the lesson was still there for all to see. The army was no longer sure. Of all the units called upon by the desperate brothers in the palace basement, only Kim had answered. The others waited. Had the Revolutionary Committee stormed the palace with determination, the army and the nation would have been behind them. A purge committee was set up by the government to track down civilians and military who, during the 48 hours of suspense, had shown little alacrity to come to the aid of Diem. And when the work of the purge committee was finished, the backbone of Vietnam's military command had been broken. Some officers, feeling that they were suspect, fled to the brush. Only Diem's creatures remained in commands. A friend of Inhu's named Trong Kong Koo was appointed to direct the score settling. Another Inhu lieutenant named Nguyen Dinh Tuan became a sort of super minister with the functions of Secretary of State to the President, Defense, Psychological Warfare, and Information. The Secretary of State for Civic Action, a sort of Vietnamese Arthur Larson named Ngo Trong Hyo, took over police operations, and henceforth this trio, accountable only to Diem and Nhu, directed the Gestapo, which was to bring America's new president face to face with reality. Never again were the solutions which Senator Kennedy had supported, as a Diem partisan in the front organization led by his chief of protocol, to seem so simple. Of the civilians involved in the attempted coup, only Hoang Tio Thu escaped. He fled to France. Phan Quang Dan and his friend Pham Kok Su were arrested, along with many of then associates. Colonel Di and Lieutenant Colonel Dong, accompanied by a handful of fellow officers, commandeered a DC-3 at gunpoint and took refuge in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Diem emerged a general of brigade and the Judas of the army. Real victor of the fracas was the Communist National Liberation Front. The number of adherents to it mounted with every day that Diem remained in power, and News Vengeance Committee continued in operation. Jean Lartigue proclaimed in heavy headlines in Paris press of November 26, "Hurry, Mr. Kennedy, the Communists are about to win the Dien Bien Phu of the rotting war on the free world's Asiatic front." His report in retrospect seems written with clairvoyance. Ambassadors, military commanders, and special services each draw their own conclusions, settling scores according to their personal sympathies or antipathies, but for the most part doing nothing. They waited to see whether America would vote Democrat or Republican. Nine. Oh, Lartigue continued. Yet this was the moment when great decisions should have been taken in all the fragile countries that cling to life only through perpetual injections of dollars. A few administrative traditions inherited from their former colonizers and the armies which they must pay. Train and arm. Bisinciles. Bendiu. For 3 months there was a vacuum. The communists jumped in to fill it. Act quickly, Mr. Kennedy. If you do not want to see the red flag floating over Saigon, Vientiane, Bangkok, Phnom Penh, Rangoon, and Singapore, and the Occident driven from the Orient forever. Diem is committing suicide in South Vietnam. The situation is gravest. Failure of the coup d'etat on November 11 permitted a condemned regime to survive. But it is no longer supported by the people, and President Diem has shown himself incapable of fighting communism effectively. His police state system has alienated the people of the South to a point where they are exclaiming, "QL may as well have the Viet Minh." 9. William Buckley's National Review of that same date, November 26, 1960, unburdened by Mr. Lartigue's vast personal knowledge of Southeast Asia, told its readers the Russians were hotting up the Cold War. It was that simple. Last week they provoked and backed an attempt to unseat the authoritarian and strongly pro-American regime of Ngo Dinh Diem, wrote National Review. Diem was so pro-American that the anti-rebel and anti-communist committee he and New had thrown together as a front was distributing handbills from army trucks, telling Vietnamese who would not accept the line that communists had instigated the coup, that colonialists and British and American imperialists had incited the paratroopers. None of this reached the American public. Don Fifield of the NY Herald Tribune News Service reported that the Saigon coup seemed inevitable. Washington Post. November 12, 1960. But a frank disclosure of the facts would have constituted an admission that everything told the public to date had been false, and such an admission neither the press nor the State Department had any intention of making. Lartigue, author of a long list of books on Southeast Asia, was not quoted by a single American paper when he wrote of the denunciations, the mass arrests, and the posters demanding vengeance, which left most Vietnamese only with a feeling of regret that the coup had failed. Lartigue had known Dr. Dan for years, while soldiers still wearing army boots and pants, but hastily provided with shirts to make them look like civilians, were applauding Diem and New in the streets in artificial demonstrations of popularity to impress the Americans. Dan, from his place of hiding, asked Lartigue to come see him. Said Dan, "The events of the past 3 days reveal profound cracks in the political structure of the Ngo Dinh Diem regime. The army, the administration, and the people. This coup that failed marks a turning point in the destiny of South Vietnam. If the government refuses to understand the severe meaning of this warning and lets its passions override its reason, if it gives free rein to its hunger for revenge and strengthens its totalitarianism, the days to come will be black and any adventure is possible. The only beneficiary will be communism. Paris Press, November 30th, 1960. The scramble for Washington support, as logic told Saigon exiles and agents alike that America must sooner or later take another look at her showcase, was frantic. Wherever there were Vietnamese, the Vietnamese love of intrigue was evident. Exiles, honestly concerned with the fate of their country, had no entree to the American embassy in Paris. But informers, because they were paid to do so, or because of the feeling of importance it gave them, came and went with exaggerated reports on the doings of their compatriots. After each such visit, the informer, or gossiper, as the case may be, acquired face by telling his friends what the embassy official had said to him. Somehow, out of the telltale visits, first to Bill Gibson and then to Francis Meloy and his successors, word spread through the Vietnamese colony in Paris that Dr. Clayton Williams, pastor of the American Church on Quai d'Orsay, was a top CIA agent, and that his residence was a meeting place for high-echelon emissaries of Allen Dulles. Overnight, devout Vietnamese Catholics, Hoa House, and Buddhists became ardent members of Dr. Williams' congregation. So two groups took form, one Diem supporters who carried tales to the embassy, and the other anti-Diem exiles, who flattered themselves into thinking that they had a pipeline to the center of power through the pastor. Prominent among the latter was the former President de Conseil, or Prime Minister, Tran Van Hu. With a tenacity surprising in a man of his years, Tran Van Hu never ceased plotting for a return to power. First, he dreamed of making a comeback as an anti-communist protege of the Americans. When it became evident that his friendship with Foster Dulles, former pastor, was not going to bring him advancement, and the people of South Vietnam were certainly not going to call for him, Hu changed tack. He gained the support of Ho Chi Minh's followers wherever they were by becoming the man of the neutralists. And as, through popular hatred of Diem and his family, the anti-communist cause rotted from within, Tran Van Hu became the candidate for transition leadership, the Front for Nguyen Mon Ha, son-in-law of France's communist deputy, Monsieur Morin, the one American to be concerned, and he, because he was so deeply compromised, was the man whom Americans had elected only a few weeks before by the narrowest margin in history. Jack Kennedy looked over the files that had never reached the public. Considering the role the CIA and the American Aid Administration had played in the whole idiotic chapter of America's experiment in South Vietnam, the honesty of the facts placed before the new president is doubtful. One thing, however, was inescapable. Nowhere was the situation encouraging. The incoming American president was holding the bag which he and his demagoguery as senator had helped only too willingly to create. As the disintegration in Vietnam gained momentum, those responsible for it in our government were tiptoeing off the stage and turning their attention to Africa. So was the AFL-CIO. However, for President Kennedy, newly installed in the White House, escape was not quite that simple. The old days of irresponsible senatorial tirades were gone, and the search for an out from the pompous statements he had made as Senator Kennedy, proud to be a member of Diem's American lobby, must have taxed the talents of the new president to the utmost, highly developed though those talents were. The confidential reports the new president was studying, reports which never reached the American people, left no doubt that he was holding a hot potato. It was time to start looking for a way to unload. On March 8, 1960, 8 months before Colonel Thay's paratroopers blew the lid off and destroyed any illusion that either the Vietnamese army or people were behind Ngo Dinh Diem Diem, America had had her warning. American trained Brigadier General Duong Van Due, commander of the National Order and one of the young hopes of the Vietnamese army, took advantage of a trip to Paris to write a declaration which he thought would alert the world. Du had been permanent Secretary General of Vietnam's National Defense. What he said was, in view of the fact that Mr. Ngo Dinh Diem did not hesitate to assume the responsibilities of power during the extremely grave period of 1954, that his promises made at the time of assuming power led the majority of the population to believe that he was going to lead Vietnam to a brilliant future, that his efforts in the course of the first year were dedicated to the re-establishment of order and security and the removal of the effects of war. My brothers-in-arms and myself ardently served in the reconstruction of the country under the leadership of Mr. Ngo Dinh Diem Diem. In view of the fact that 1 year later the government was able to control the entire territory of the South by grace of the efforts and sacrifices of the army, the people, and the administration. Order and security being established, instead of building a democratic regime based on justice and liberty, Mr. Ngo Dinh Diem broke his promises, established a family dictatorship, backward and feudal, camouflaged as a republic. In no democratic country on earth does a government exist composed of 5 brothers of the same family and a president who has assumed the right to draw up a constitution and transmit it afterwards to a national assembly for their information. That the Vietnamese citizen has lost the most sacred rights of liberty, liberty of life, liberty of belief, and liberty of thought. Mr. Ngo Dinh Diem has seen fit to increase his police forces to consolidate his family dictatorship instead of utilizing the aid of friendly powers to erect a healthy economy and assure the vital minimum to the population. And this without considering that a large part of the national budget has been diverted to their personal ends by his brothers and their closest collaborators. The present regime is bringing the country back to the darkest days of 1954. Again, there is oppression, exploitation, and injustice. Discontent has reached a high point among all the levels of the population. The extension of communist bases, spreading throughout the South, even to the outskirts of Saigon, constitutes a grave danger. South Vietnam must inevitably be absorbed by international communism if this situation persists. Having faith in the glorious future of a truly democratic Vietnam, where each citizen would enjoy inviolable rights of freedom and liberty, I demand that Mr. Ngo Dinh Diem prove his patriotism in fulfilling the aspirations of his people. 1. Let him dissolve the puppet National Assembly. 2. Let him relinquish his functions as President of the Republic, that the people may freely decide the future of the country. If he will not do this, I have decided to return to the country and set in motion this struggle. My determination is based on the will of the oppressed people claiming their rights to liberty. Since the present regime survives by grace of a certain number of foreigners who have been misled, I draw the attention of these last to the fact that the Vietnamese people consider them accomplices to the oppression, the injustice, and the dictatorship. In 9 years of struggle against communism, the Vietnamese people have maintained their position at the price of sacrifices and heavy losses in human life. This is irrefutable proof of their determination to play a role in the free world. Before international opinion, I accuse the Ngo Dinh Diem regime of perfidy and dictatorship. At the same time, I appeal to the countries friendly to Vietnam to aid us in our struggle for justice and liberty, a struggle which, itself, will contribute to the maintenance of peace in Southeast Asia. I shall personally present this declaration to the ambassador of South Vietnam at his embassy at 3 p.m. on March 10, 1960, with the request that he transmit it to Mr. Ngo Dinh Diem. Paris, March 8, 1960. Signed, Brigadier General Duong Van Du, Commander of the National Order. True to his word, Du stomped into the Vietnam embassy at 3:00 p.m. on March 10 and demanded to see the ambassador. The ambassador called the police. The police hustled Du out and passed his declaration on to the Ministry of the Interior. All that immediately resulted was a terse order from a French official who was annoyed by Du's allusion to oppression exploitation and injustice in 1954, which was to say, under the French. Du was told to keep still, or he would be sent home to Diem and New, the last thing Du wanted. He had been captured by the Viet Minh while fighting under the French. Most men would rather die than go through that experience. Under the process which Ho Chi Minh specialists had perfected for reducing tough foreign legionnaires to human wrecks, Du was given the works. The man doing the breaking was none other than Joe Alsop's hero, Albert Pham Ngo Cao, then Ho Chi Minh's intelligence chief. When Du delivered his declaration, Pham Ngoc Thao was the right-hand man and secret police chief of Ng Chieu Dinh Hu. For 6 years, Du had served in Diem's army, forced to watch the communist whom he had known as the man-breaker gain power. And Du needed no psychology book to tell him that men hate and distrust those whom they have broken. For 6 years, Pham Ngoc Thao, applying for NGO, he knew the same methods he had practiced for Ho Chi Minh, had also watched the officer who would get him someday if Thao did not get him first. In the end, Thao held the field. Du delivered his declaration and thereafter existed on handouts from Vietnamese restaurants. Shortly after General Du's startling declaration was delivered out of the blue, Jean-Marc Dufour, the French Far East specialist who had been employed by USS in Phnom Penh at the time of the February 1959 plot to depose the Cambodian monarch, warned in La Nation Française. Since the Chinese New Year, in February, the Viet Minh have never ceased to gain ground. Murders succeed murders and ambushes succeed ambushes. The most recent and the most striking assassinations were those of the provincial governor of Vinh Long, the recruitment commander of Tan Nguyen Anh, the sports and youth leader of the same region. The number of assassinations of officials and police average 10 a day. The Viet Minh Rebellion has become an organized military rebellion with a supreme command in the field, able to maneuver openly in battalion strength. Next, on September 20th, 1960, the European edition of the New York Herald Tribune broke the conspiracy of silence and published a letter written by a Vietnamese who signed himself General Tai Son. Said he, "All newspapers around the world, and particularly those of the U.S., are aware of an unusual scandal, almost unique in the history of modern times, the control of a supposedly democratic country by a single family. The true structure of this government by family, the most undemocratic and authoritarian in free Asia, is as follows. 1. At the top is the president himself, Ngo Dinh Diem. 2. Brother, Ngo Dinh Hu, advisor of the president, controls government, army, business, police, assembly, and revolutionary party. Lao, whose 70 underground members throughout the nation spend much of their time giving police information about their neighbors. 3. Brother Ngo Dinh Nguyen is the ambassador to London, Tunis, Brussels, and Bonn, and controls the funds of all these embassies. 5. Brother Ngo Dinh Thuc is Roman Catholic Bishop of Vinh Long and controls all churches in Vietnam. 6. Mrs. Ngo Dinh Nhu, pretty wife of Nhu, First Lady of Diem's dynasty, controls all big business and secret funds. 7. The father of Mrs. Nhu, Mr. Tran Van Truong, is ambassador to Washington, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, and controls the funds of these embassies. 8. The mother of Mrs. Nhu is representative of Vietnam in the UN and controls the licensing of commercial enterprises. Diem's regime is supported by the U.S. $1 million a day. It rules not through and for the people, but through his family, and for said family. And it is on this that the communists mainly place their hopes. Each month, from 250 to 300 government officials and supporters are brutally murdered by red guerrillas. General Tai Son. Saigon. Considering that Kennedy knew of all this, and much more of which the public was unaware. His appointment of Angier Biddle-Duke to the post of Chief of Protocol appears a graceful way of collapsing American Friends of Vietnam and getting both the organization's head and its most prominent member out from under. Chapter 21. The Scramble to Get Out from Under. It was labor that emerged as the master of America's destiny and decider of foreign policy. Labor's decisions had been delivered with the ring of authority in the AFL-CIO's political organ New Leader. Sometimes labor leaders themselves did the talking, or again, it might be their scholastic front, Michigan State University. Policies changed, but as one policy disastrous for America was dropped for another one doomed to be worse, no note of doubt was ever permitted to creep into the new leader's line to America's unionized sheep. On February 22, 1954, the new leader published How to Win in Indochina by David J. Dallin. Obviously, the first move was to kick out the French. Then came the specious special issue of June 27, 1955, which we have mentioned, in which Austrian socialist Joseph Buttinger said Ho Chi Minh was the man the West should have supported, but since Ho had been forced into the arms of the communists by French colonial policies, Diem was the man to back. The line was always, "This is the way to win," but following a slowly changing spectrum of nuances, the solutions changed. The new leader, which is to say, American labor, and Michigan State University, however, were always side by side, and the trend was always downward. As the bankruptcy of the policy of supporting a hated family instead of a country became more evident, the plunges of the losing gamblers became more desperate. On November 2, 1959, and again on December 7, the new leader carried pro-Diem articles by Michigan State's Professor Wesley Fischel. Wolf Ledijinsky did his bit to perpetuate both Diem's reign and his own job through a new leader article in 1960. While Far Eastern Survey and Pacific Affairs obediently printed the flood of scholarly articles being turned out by Michigan State, still under contract to train Vietnam's public administrators and police. Never did Fischel's group warn America of the danger on the horizon. In mid-1959, agencies in Washington blocked the passport renewal of the author of this book for trying to do so. They informed the French equivalent of FBI that the opposition in Vietnam had been formed and was being directed by Mr. du Berrier, and that said opposition's headquarters in Phnom Penh occupied a house rented in Mr. du Berrier's name. Since said opposition was known to be without funds, American agents having helped Diem and Inhu cut off their resources, the American report went on to assert that Mr. du Berrier was believed to have acquired funds for the Diem opposition from an unnamed foreign power, Red China implied. Mr. du Berrier's expulsion from France, it was hinted, would be appreciated. A disgusted French official passed the report on to the author with the laconic query, "Who is trying to get you?" 30 minutes had sufficed to assure the French DST, the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, French equivalent of the FBI, that the American plaint was false. On November 11, 1960, came the revolt of the paratroopers. The drum beating over Diem's forthcoming elections scheduled for April 9, 1961, showed no abatement of official American enthusiasm for our man. But the boys on the inside, the small group of string pullers who had run things as they pleased, were washing their hands of the results of the new leader's old how-to-win formulae. Henceforth Sol Levitas, editor of the labor publication in question, described the Saigon government as an autocratic, corrupt, and ineffective regime. American labor's wandering ambassador, Irving Brown, could not have failed to find the second page of Paris, Press of December 2, 1960, neatly folded on his desk for filing. With Alex Reynaud's report on South Vietnam, which rots and decomposes, said Reynaud. A woman, Madame Ungin Nu, is the Lucrezia Borgia of the regime. She concentrates the hatred of all the opposition to the Diem Party. Brown was no fool. Though the American public was not yet ready for such blunt truths, he knew it was time to drop a hot potato. Out of East Lansing, Michigan on February 18, 1961, came a UPI dispatch announcing that the establishment of an African language center at Michigan State University has made the institution one of the few places in the U.S. where African languages can be learned under the teaching of expert linguists. The AP, on the same date, reported a parade through pouring rain at Michigan State to mourn the death of Patrice Lumumba. Of the late but unlamented Vietnam Project, not a word. And the transfer to Africa of official after official responsible for our disastrous Southeast Asia policy passed unnoticed. To conceal from the duped American taxpayers the fact that their much-touted experiment was sinking, and that the boys in the know were deserting it, drums kept on beating for the new Democratic elections set for April. Again, Diem picked his opponents, a 73-year-old Oriental faith healer named Ho Phu Tran, and a rich planter, a former friend of Ho Chi Minh, named Nguyen Dinh Quat. Communists lose a round to Colonel. That was the way Joe Alsop hailed Diem's victory in the New York Herald Tribune of April 11, 1961. The thou he was glorifying was Albert Ho Chi Minh's erstwhile intelligence chief. In the same April 11 issue, Edgar E. Clark told Americans pro-Western President Ngo Dinh Diem won a surprising landslide victory in his bid for re-election for a 5-year term. All Mr. Right. Diem's critics, both here and abroad, cannot deny that the election was Democrat. The voting and counting were as straight as could be. There was nothing wrong with either so far as the beadiest-eyed observer could see. No, there was any. On April 12, Joe Alsop gave the beast-become hero Albert Pham, Doc Tao, another plug in a column headed, April Fool for Colonel Hung. Betrayal. 2 days later, on April 14th, a Herald Tribune editorial hailed the election outcome as a red setback in South Vietnam. Joe Alsop was just warming up. His column in the same issue was, Colonel, that was war. Time was in on it also. Time of April 21 told followers of the Loose Line that Diem had responded to some sound advice from lean ex-communist Colonel Pham Ngoc Thao by handing Colonel Thao command of vital, rice-growing Kien Hoa province. Thao got 83% of his voters to the polls. The report continued. We tried a little propaganda on our own, Thao admits. We told the people that if they did not vote, they would have trouble getting jobs or help from the government. An oblique way of saying that American aid dangled before a suffering countryside bought Diem a victory. However, no letter pointing out this fact ever appeared in print in Time magazine, nor were Europe's down-to-earth comments ever passed on to the American public. Paris, Press of April 4, screamed, "The communists have taken the offensive in South Vietnam," adding, "If the deterioration of public institutions in South Vietnam is evident, the police system of the government is still solid enough to assure President Diem a victory next Sunday." Figuronine's Saigon correspondent, François Nivelon, cabled on April 6th, "Let's admit at once that the victory of President Ngo Dinh and his teammate Vice President Nguyen Dinh Toa is certain. The chances of their adversaries are non-existent. We can only deplore the fact that the opposition did not throw candidates of any importance into the battle. Both men are anti-communist and anti-neutralist, but they are not supported by any of the known opposition movements." No. Jean-Marc Dufour wrote in La Nation Française, the Paris weekly quoted by National Review on all subjects but South Vietnam, that the formality of Diem's re-election proved nothing but the perfect organization of his police. There was, however, Dufour admitted, something new in the recent campaign. An American public relations man, which led the Washington Post to exclaim that Diem had undertaken a handshaking tour in the best American style. After that, can one reasonably doubt the popularity of Ngo Diem? Asked Mr. Dufour. The fly in the ointment, as he saw it, was that despite the efforts of Dr. Wesley Fischel of Michigan State University and public relations man Harold Orem, the principal problem remained unsolved. While Diem was enjoying a promenade through the countryside and chatting with the villagers, armed bands numbering as many as 300 men were attacking the regular army. Since Diem commanded neither the loyalty of the army nor that of the country, Dufour concluded, everything seems impossible. The opposition is reduced to exile by the police and to impotence by exile, which leaves only the communists in position to become Diem's heirs. Nani, scrutator, commentator in the London Sunday Times of May 14, 1961, told British readers that President Ngo Dinh had mellowed to a point where his electors no longer find it necessary to give him more votes than they can count heads. His American backing is more lavish than ever, yet his seat is becoming uncomfortable, the communists having begun to seep into his territory and to slaughter his officials at night. Scrutator added, suppose the Americans had intervened at the time of the Dien Bien Phu disaster, and had somehow reconquered all of Indo-China. They would still have saddled themselves with the indefensible Mr. Bao, Diem, and his family. Garawai. Why the reporter decided to do a turnabout and publish Stanley Carno's article, Dien defeats his own best troops, in the issue of January 19, 1961, or how Camo happened to write it, has never been explained. When Darrell Barrington's sugar-coated propaganda for Ngo Diem appeared in the Reporter of September 20, 1956, editor Phil Horton had nothing but aloof disdain for anyone trying to talk sense to him on the subject. And Stan Carno, then in the Paris Bureau of Time Life, was too busy setting up a ski trip for the weekend to bother to talk to Dr. D. Nguyen Ton Hoan. When Hoan went to his office, Victor Lasky, out of loyalty to his friend Harold Orem, or because Orem was paying him for every plug he could give the foundering Ngo Diem, reached far out to work a boost for Diem into an article against Robert Welch and the John Birch Society. Syndicated by the North American Newspaper Alliance, Lasky's column, Welch Throws Wild Punches at Reds, appeared in the Indianapolis Star of April 11, 1961, 2 days after Diem's re-election. 2 days after Diem's re-election. How much does Welch really know about Asian affairs? Asked Lasky, whose own knowledge of Asia was derived from evenings spent at the bar of the Overseas Press Club with Diem's public relations huckster, fishing for a free trip to Saigon. Lasky wrote that Welch, once a year, devotes his monthly American opinion to a scoreboard of communist influence in over 100 nations. For each country he presents a percentage score on the degree of red infiltration. What his yardstick is, he does not say. No. Actually, Welch did some explaining which Victor Lasky omitted, and studied in retrospect, without any distortions, Welch comes out much better than Lasky. For what American Opinion's yearly scoreboard attempted to estimate was not communist infiltration, but the percentage of power communists would be able to throw into the streets in a given country under favorable conditions using all the forces, communist or otherwise, that might be brought into their game. Considering that President Kennedy himself admitted the communist assassination of 4,000 local officials in Vietnam in 1960, and authorities such as Dr. Bernard Fall set the figure at closer to 13,000. In a country that had only 12,000 to 14,000 villages in all, the 70% to 90% estimate of red strength, which Lasky pooh-poohed, was conservative. Buddhists, students, tribesmen of the high plateau regions, the army and the countryside awaited only an opportunity to end Diem's 6 years of abuse of power. And villages where officials remained alive were villages obedient to the Reds. In March 1961, Vice President Johnson took off for a junket to South Vietnam, a trip fraught with significance. With him were all the usual hangers-on of government and press. A sort of triumphant visit to a satrapy with all eyes and cameras focused on America's vice president, who had been selected for the Kennedy ticket by a Russian-born labor leader named Dave Dubinsky. In the rear of the plane bearing Vice President Johnson's entourage sat an unobtrusive little man in gray named Suffrage. He was president of the Retail Clerks Union of America, which is an AFL-CIO affiliate. Why should a labor union president accompany a vice presidential junket to Vietnam? The question was never asked. At each stop, the spotlight was focused on Lyndon Johnson. Officials awaited him, cameras clicked, honor guards were drawn up. No one noticed the little group that whisked Mr. Suffrage away for a meeting elsewhere, behind closed doors, to discuss what? Was Suffrage regimenting native labor opposition against Diem? Was Lyndon taking attention away from Suffrage while Vietnam labor told its story and a LCIO strengthened its hand to name Diem's successor? When the big plane turned its nose toward America on the homeward journey, the little labor leader in gray was back in his seat, as colorless and expressionless as ever. But back in Saigon, word went out that a change was in the works. Britain's Liberal Observer, foreign news service, provider of many of the feature articles Americans read in the New York Herald Tribune, filed a report out of Saigon by Dennis Bloodworth on June 7, 1961. It was the usual, winning story, but its main objective was to swell the chorus of the Joe Alsop campaign to sell Albert Pham Ngoc Thao. Bold experiment tried by South Viet Colonel was the way the European edition of the Herald Tribune headlined it on June 8. A column of priceless publicity in one of America's largest papers followed, telling how in his campaign to win confidence, Colonel Thao's first act on taking over Kien Hoa province was to release from 1,200 to 1,500 suspects arrested on suspicion of aiding communist guerrilla. Nothing was said of Thao's record as torturer and intelligence chief for Ho Chi Minh, nor his role as head of News Secret Police in filling Diem's prison with the anti-communist opposition. In fact, the Bloodworth article continued, to the astonishment and sometimes fury of his superiors, Pham Ngoc Thao also set free some of the Viet Cong his men had captured, allowing them to walk out of prison camps with their weapons. Colonel Thao has trained his men not to return fire when the Viet Cong open up on them, but quietly to note the position of the communists and encircle them. The Viet Cong could not capture arms fast enough, so Thao was letting prisoners, personal friends perhaps, walk out with them. The order not to return fire was explained as a move to ring the enemy for a mass capture, which, alas, never took place. While Lyndon Johnson provided a shelter for labor diplomacy and Albert Pham Ngoc Thao liberated captured, allowing them to take their guns to prove that our side was not afraid of them. The intentions of America's new president were ambiguous. It is not easy to do a volte-face on a policy when one has been a vociferous member of the lobby supporting it. Kennedy began sending missions to Vietnam while he stalled for time, groping for an out. Strangely enough, one of the best reports on this period, written by an American in Saigon who signed himself D, appeared in the March 12, 1962 issue of the New Republic, but, like Stanley Camo's article in The Reporter of January 19, 1961, it was rejected by conservative Americans out of distrust of the organ in which it appeared. They said, beginning with the mission of Vice President Johnson in March 1961. Followed in rapid succession by the Staley and A. General Taylor missions. Washington began to learn in a few weeks and months what had been available for it to know for the past 6 years. That a communist led and directed guerrilla movement, feeding on large-scale popular discontent in the villages and aided by North Vietnam, but to a far less extent than is said. This again is part of the new myth, was about to take over South Vietnam directly from under the feet of the Diem regime. In Washington parlance, the town really hit the panic button. Around the clock unit was set up on the 7th floor of the newest of the new State Department buildings to coordinate all activities concerning Vietnam. And hotel space in Saigon became totally unavailable as an unending stream of visitors from Washington and Wekenpak. Commander in Chief Pacific Area Command began to investigate the Vietnam situation for themselves. A brief flurry of hope followed departure from Saigon of General Taylor's mission. Although Taylor had been carefully screened from all Americans in Saigon, whose views might have clashed with the official myths, he had seen and learned enough to come through with a report which in all likelihood was to advocate some deep-seated political changes. Obviously, the most important political change envisaged was the dumping of NU and his wife. Without them, the country could still, just possibly, be rallied behind Diem. But there was not a hope. As Z described the Saigon reaction, the government-controlled press of South Vietnam let loose against the U.S. Gulf a barrage of insults whose viciousness and inanity can only be matched by Peking or Havana on particularly bad days. On November 24, 1961, Saigon Stoi Bao, the journal, printed an 8-column headline reading, "Republic of Vietnam Guinea Pig for Capitalistic Imperialism. Is it not time to revise Vietnamese American collaboration?" A similar tack was taken by the other newspapers, and for a while it looked as if the moment of truth had arrived on both sides. But nothing of the sort occurred. Washington simply and purely capitulated. Having thus abandoned all hope of standing up to the Diem regime, Washington topped off its total surrender by sending the new Foreign Aid Director, Fowler Hamilton, to Saigon in mid-January 1962. And Hamilton, according to the Associated Press, was impressed by the strength, vigor, and competence of the men he met. Behind the scenes, a more deadly power struggle than they imagined was going on. Those in the know were aware that Diem could not agree to reforms, for Diem had had no final say as to what was going on for months, perhaps even the past 2 years. Gradually power had passed to Nu, who, on the pretext of taking a burden off his brother's shoulders, had made the transition from advisor to ruler. Nu was not going to submit to his own ousting, nor was he about to launch pleas for Mike Mansfield to support the regime for just a little longer, as he had in April of 1955. Secret negotiations with Ho Chi Minh for a neutral American Free South Vietnam under himself had reached a stage where Nu was convinced that America dared not cut loose and cared little if she did. Even while Nu's treasonable negotiations were going on, however, the effects of Mr. B. Suffrage's road paving under the shelter of Lyndon Johnson were being felt. The junket to Saigon by a Professor Staley in June of 1961 was not to affect the long-term deterioration in Vietnam one iota. For, to put it in American beatnik terms, Staley was off on a strategic Hamlet kick. It was the age of the egghead America, which Jacqueline Kennedy was later to compare with the brief, shimmering age of Camelot. For the small group of men who never under normal circumstances would have approached the center of power, and who, after Kennedy, were never likely to do so again, the comparison was valid. To Staley, Strategic hamlets were the answer, and the American taxpayer paid for Staley's folly in dollars while Jis and Vietnamese paid with their lives. Then, in September, to the loud ballyhooing of radio, TV and press, came General Maxwell Taylor's plea for political reforms. But there was no communications media spotlight thrown on the mission of Irving Brown. Mr. Rel. Irving Brown. F.L. Owl. COO's roving ambassador who boasted of having traveled 500,000 miles in the cause of anti-communism, mostly sowing revolts in colonies that have since passed from Allied rule to communists, was dispatched on a Vietnam fact-finding trip for American labor. His confidential report, dated November 27, 1961, ran to 9 single-space typewritten pages and can be summed up in a few lines. The new man to back in South Vietnam is the Confederation of Vietnam labor leader, Tran Quoc Bu, described by Brown as the most outstanding trade union leader and individual I met in Saigon. Brown added, Bu still has the confidence of Diem, but Bu himself has lost much of his confidence in Diem, especially his entourage. Translated into plain language, Bu is still trusted by the Palace, so he can attack from the inside if we will get behind him. Aye. The buildup of Bu started from that moment. The fall of Diem gained momentum, but the boys who selected Diem in the first place were determined to name his successor. How to Win in Vietnam would still be announced through New Leader magazine. In the months between suffrages, Tripp and Brown's, Ho Chi Minh's veterans of the Nam Bo set up the scaffolding of their National Liberation Front in South Vietnam. In December 1961, a commando operation effected the liberation of left-wing lawyer named An Gyu Tho, whom Diem had interned, and with Nguyen Hue Tho as their president, the new Red Front prepared to rally under a banner of fake nationalism all the groups deprived of any other alternative by America's blind support of the NGO Dins. Among them was a group called the Patriotic and Believing Catholics. Washington, however, ignored all this and remained preoccupied only with support for Diem. One reason may have been, as George Chaffard explains in his book on that period, that Ambassador Frederick Nulting had made some feeble efforts to move Diem. But when he saw that he could not influence that stubborn chief of state, he decided to become a friend of the UNUs, to try to convince them. Instead, he became their tool. Chapter 22. Enter Cabot Lodge. The year 1962 broke over the dying country that had once been the Rice Bowl of Southeast Asia in another wave of communist onslaughts. The obstinate Mandarin from Hue had moved from Gia Long Palace, the scene of his early struggles. February found Diem Nu, Madame Nu, and Thuk, who was about to become Archbishop of Hue, the Buddhist stronghold in the north, all living in Din Doc Lap Palace, which Diem had chosen as his presidential residence. How aware the people of the CIA, the USS, American aid, or the embassy were of the inroads the National Liberation Front was making, as one village after another embraced the communists as liberators from the NGO Dins, is hard to say. A frightened officialdom had hustled Miss Sandra Davies out of Saigon on a couple of days' notice in 1958, and transferred her to the embassy in Manila on charges that she was going native, which was a way of saying that she had established a rapport with Vietnamese and was beginning to learn what was going on. The clique tolerated only those who closed their eyes and parroted their myth. Despite both Vietnamese and American censorship, the news seeped through. All Southeast Asia knew of Vietnam's jolting series of setbacks in the field in late February 1962. First, the Civil Guard was mauled in 3 lightning actions. With the people of the countryside giving no warning to government troops, the Viet Cong struck, inflicted heavy casualties, and after each attack, pulled out with a new haul of ammunition and weapons. Then at 6:50 a.m. on Tuesday, February 27, two Air Force lieutenants, Pham Phu Quoc and Nguyen Van Q, instead of carrying out the bombing mission south of Saigon, to which they had been assigned, attacked the presidential palace. For 50 minutes they bombed and strafed Dinh Doc Lap. Diem was mysteriously warned and managed to get to his underground bunker just in time. Madame New fell through a hole in the floor, but came out with minor scratches and bruises. Lieutenant Quoc was brought down by anti-aircraft fire, but Q, a brilliant young pilot who had received 23 months of training in the U.S., escaped to Cambodia, where he announced that the Air Force could no longer support Diem's dictatorship and that other revolts were in store. The Vietnamese people and elements of the army detest Diem's regime and family, said QI. Diem's reply was to ground the Air Force and launch another purge. Through the Directorate General of Information, a series of communiques denounced the reactionaries as well as the communists who were responsible for the outrage. With reactionaries, a hint of new scapegoats came into the picture for the first time. There was more than a suspicion that Diem and Hu, without coming out and saying so, were aiming at the Americans. But what Americans? The old intelligence, information, aid, and embassy combine of the past, or someone new. Probably the best indication of who was trying to get the Kennedy administration out from under is to be found in James Restone's column, which appeared in the New York Times on June 18, 1964, more than 2 years later. Restone wrote, "With the possible exception of Cuba, Vietnam has arrested the Attorney General's attention more than any other foreign policy problem. Under President Kennedy, he was a leader in the decision to mount a counterinsurgency policy in that country. He was involved in all the maneuvers that led to the administration's open opposition to the Diem regime in Saigon. Vietnam is the third of the momentous tests in the Cold War. The U.S. proved in Korea that it could deal with a major limited war. It proved in the Cuban crisis that it could deal with the threat of a nuclear war, but the challenge of subversive warfare has not yet been met, and this is the test of Vietnam. More than almost anybody else in the administration, Robert Kennedy has been fascinated by the techniques and possibilities of counter-insurgency, has been involved in Vietnam and its problems for the past 3 years, and has the prestige and authority to pull together what is now a divided and rather confused team of State Department, Defense Department, and Central Intelligence operators on the scene. In other words, for years Jack Kennedy, as senator, had obediently read from Senate floor and lecture platforms any paper put in his hands by Arthur E. Goldberg or Angier Biddle Duke, humming Diem Lobby. But after he reached the White House, his brother Bobby took over. Described by Paris Press as having all the sentimentality of a panther, and having shed his last tear at the age of 7. Bobby's constant dread was an insurrection against the Rostow, Wiesner, Schlesinger programs of his brother Dan's counterinsurgency, how to quell an insurrection if in power or win one if on the outside, became Bobby's passion, and South Vietnam his testing ground for experiments. Irving Brown's late 1961 recommendation that labor boss Boo be taken up as America's man had no doubt joined the other papers in Bobby's hands. With all the realism of his law of the jungle mentality, he read the signs and, whether the public was prepared for it or not, told his brother it was time to unload. To Bobby, Lieutenant Ku's and Lieutenant Kokchi bombing of the palace was no isolated incident. The reactionaries whom Diem and New denounced after the bombing were in the White House. Whether Bobby and his brother still thought the war in South Vietnam could be won, or had any intentions of trying to win it, is one of the secrets locked in the breasts of men noted for their subterfuge. Whatever Bobby thought privately, it was not yet time to tell America that the years of ballyhoo had been false, and the big experiment was on the skids. That Diem's family knew the end was near became evident in the summer of 1962, when Diem's niece, the wife of Tran Trung Dung, former Secretary of State for Defense, visited Paris. Sitting in a restaurant in Montparnasse, surrounded by her countrymen avid for news from home, she replied to their questioning, "How can I be optimistic? The people detest my family. One of these days we will all be lynched. I am making plans to take refuge in Paris before it is too late. I ask myself what the NGO family is waiting for that they do not get out of there before they are all massacred." Indochina. Dix, still independence, Indochina. 10 Years of Independence. By George Chaffard. Coleman Levy, 294 pages. Non. Less informed than Madame Trantron Dung. America's U.S. Operations Mission Beavers were still going full speed ahead, enjoying the heady experience of moving families from where they wanted to be and shutting them up in villages which the Viet Cong picked off at will. It was their show, and they enjoyed every minute of the spending and propaganda spree accompanying Mr. Rapp. Staley's Strategic Hamlets. A new social system was created. Those showing most enthusiasm for the Hamlets formed a new, favored class at the top. Immediately after them came their families and relatives. At the bottom were the NAKs, the poor peasants for whom the social revolution was supposedly being carried out. American military chiefs in South Vietnam had nothing to say about the defense of what was really America's do-it-big equivalent of the 1954 guard towers of the 1954 guard towers of the French, large enough to take in a village. These strategic hamlets were under the economic and financial advisor to the government of South Vietnam, i.e., the man who allotted $8. Deem's civil guard was also under him. All the ingredients of a first-class explosion were in the crucible, but still, out of cynicism, determination to tell the public what it wanted to hear, reluctance to backtrack and admit 8 years of guilt, or maybe a forlorn hope that a miracle might yet appear and save them. America's mass communications media continued the hoax. The leaders were Joe Alsop and Marguerite Higgins, whom Diem and knew had accorded preeminence through invitations to the palace and photographs taken with the president. Such photographs became tangible evidence of authority, and on Diem's and New's continued importance hinged each name dropping apologists' claim to stature. Madame Suzanne Le Bon wrote in the Washington World of July 24, 1962, "Nothing indeed could justify a revolt of the masses in South Vietnam. Anyone wandering round the country, as I have done several times, can testify to a miraculous improvement." Though all Vietnam was waiting for an upheaval, without knowing exactly how or when, reassuring statements continued to flow from travelers of supposedly independent means who were just wandering around, but were always preceded by warnings over Asia's age. Old bamboo wireless that it would be dangerous to approach them and suicidal to tell them anything the police might not like. If Americans were taken in by such statements, not so the Viet Cong. Through the labor unions of Western Europe and a London group headed by a certain labor member of Parliament, Hanoi was kept informed of the Kennedy teams groping for a way out. The question was whom they would back in place of Diem. Hanoi jumped to the conclusion that it could only be Nguyen Ton Hon, since he was the only opposition leader with a party. Ding Lei. On September 27, 1962, the French communist Daily Humanite turned its heavy artillery on Hon as the war monger and puppet of the Americans. The de Gaulle press stated that Hon was unacceptable because he was for continuation of the war. Apparently both Paris and Hanoi feared that logic might triumph over no-winism in Washington. The fear was unfounded. On January 2, 1963, came the rude jolt when regiment after regiment of the Viet Cong, recruited and trained on the spot, surged from nowhere out of the delta heart of Mytho province to defeat a Vietnamese national army equipped with American 105mm artillery, amphibian craft, helicopters, and an air force. Placed before the Kennedy team in Washington, the debacle was called the Battle of Paperback. Grim as it was, it did not deter American advisors from arming Viet Cong guerrillas, on the theory that, Infiltrators are among the best targets for conversion to fighters against communists. Washington Post, January 25, 1963. The United States has armed some Viet Cong sympathizers along with anti-communist tribesmen in a bold gamble to gain control of the highlands in South Vietnam, gushed an AP dispatch out of Saigon on January 24, 1963. The report added, however, that the experiment had not always been successful, as in the case of Plai Mrong, where 39 defenders had been killed. So it was admitted that the defenders of the strategic hamlet of Plai Mrong paid for an unpardonable stupidity no high school freshman would have committed, and to the tune of a basket full of severed hands left behind as a thank you. A highly informed source said that 50 Viet Cong sympathizers who aided the attack have been arrested, AP unblushingly continued, but many probably will be released after stern reprimands and allowed to return to their villages, while military men scurried between Washington and Saigon, with plans for re-establishing a military balance. And the AFL-CIO's policy formers pushed Irving Brown's recommendations. The crisis that secret police and American dollars had staved off for 9 years was rapidly approaching. Its scene, Hue, the feudal seat of the Ngo Dins. Monsignor Ngo Dinh Thuc, Archbishop of the Diocese, Doyen of the Episcopate in Vietnam, Chancellor of the University of Dalat, was preparing a sacerdotal jubilee to mark the 25th anniversary of his accession in the church. May 5 was the date set. Diem himself was to attend. Therefore, Thuc and his brother Can planned to turn the celebration into a political manifestation for the family. Businessmen complained that they were shaken down for contributions. With each cash donation, a message of congratulation was expected. From all directions, the non-spontaneous expressions of goodwill poured in. One, however, which had been expressly solicited, failed to appear. Ngo Dinh Can demanded of the venerable Thic Tin Kiet what had happened to his telegram. Kiet, president of the Association of Vietnamese Buddhists, whose spiritual fief was also Hue, replied that he was not sending one. The refusal was not a mark of hostility to the Roman Catholic religion. Under other circumstances, Kiet would gladly have added his fraternal felicitations to the others. But he knew that his message would be used politically as proof of the Buddhist superior's satisfaction with the Ngo Dins. Dinh. George Schaff Ord observed Indokini Dix, A.N.S., de l'Independence, that Ngo Dinh Can was not in the habit of pardon. Others claim that it was at Archbishop Thuc's request that DFM banned the display of Buddhist emblems. In any case, Thuc's revenge came next day in the form of an order on the eve of the celebration of Buddha's 2.005 birthday that no Buddhist flags or religious emblems should be displayed. The crowd began to manifest its displeasure. Still, Thic Tin Kiet urged his followers to remain calm. On May 8, the date of Buddha's birthday, Dr. Erich Wolff, a 39-year-old German from Freiburg University, strolled among the crowd, milling around the Hue radio station at 9:30 am, the hot, humid evening. Accompanied by one of his students, Wolff enjoyed the festive air. Several thousand people were massed in the streets to hear the speeches that always had been simultaneously broadcast and transmitted over loudspeakers. Suddenly, a monk's voice came over the air, announcing that the ceremony had been banned by the government. A wave of surprise and indignation went through me crowd. "Remain calm," the voice of the monk continued. "The provincial governor is coming to discuss the matter." A few minutes later, the governor, a Buddhist, arrived. A monk asked the crowd to applaud him and clear a passage, which they obediently did. Automatically, tension subsided. About 15 minutes after the governor entered the radio building, Dr. Wolff heard the sound of motors and turned to see 4 armored cars enter the garden. His student told him, "We had better get out of here." Others apparently had the same idea. As they approached one of the exits of the garden, Wolff heard the crack of automatic weapons. People threw themselves on the ground. Wolf and the student ran for their lives. A little later, with another German doctor, Wolf went to the hospital where 15 wounded people were being treated. A nurse suggested that he look in the morgue. 8 dead, 1 woman and 7 children, ranging from 7 to 15 years, reposed on the slabs, partially decapitated by heavy machine gun fire. Later, it was learned that Commander Deng Sai, the governor's Catholic assistant, under orders from NGO Din Can, was responsible for the massacre while his superior was in the radio building, supposedly negotiating. The mob had had its sight of blood, and from that day, with its senseless machine gunning in the radio station garden, there was no turning back. On May 12th, Buddhist leaders addressed a petition to the government bearing 5 demands: liberty of religious meetings and activities, granting of the same status to the Buddhist religion as that enjoyed by the Catholics by virtue of Ordinance 10 of the Constitution, immediate cessation of all persecution of the Buddhists, suppression of the law forbidding the showing of Buddhist flags and symbols, complete indemnity for victims of the May 8 massacre, and punishment of those responsible. On May 15, Diem received a Buddhist delegation dispatched to Saigon to beg consideration of their petition, none of the demands of which were unreasonable. But Diem ignored them. By May 30, nothing had been done. Then started the hunger strikes and the protest marches around Hughes to Dam Pagoda. If Diem had appeared conciliatory on May 15th, it was only to gain time, and perhaps to placate the more apprehensive of the American. In reality, he was convinced that he had won and the Buddhist demands would be forgotten. On June 2, a personal emissary from the palace arrived in Hue with orders toward firmer repression. Out of the propaganda machine in Saigon flew the official version of the Hue machine gunning. It was all communist propaganda. Frederick Nolting, the American ambassador, backed him his friends in the presidential palace with a statement that during his 2.5-year stay, he had seen no religious persecution. The Intersect Committee for the Defense of Buddhism replied with a communique stating that Mr. Nolting should have been in central Vietnam these past 5 years if he wanted to see how frequent were the cases of persecution of which the Buddhists were victims. And these acts, in the name of legality, almost always by administrative and military officials who were Catholic. Few press services transmitted the Buddhist reply. It was illegal, said the government, to fast as a sign of protest. Barbed wire barricades went up overnight around Hue's principal pagodas. On June 3rd, the students went into the streets to protest against the barbed wire. The barricade stayed, and a fury of anti-government slogans and placards resulted. Then the troops went into action. Dr. Rick Woofy noted that the soldiers were carrying bottles containing a dark brown liquid, which they threw into the crowd. On breaking, they gave off a cloud of toxic gas. Dr. Wolf counted 62 victims with 2nd and 3rd degree burns accompanied by stomach and larynx convulsions and a fall in blood pressure. Many of the victims were blinded. 36 hours later, those burned by the gas were rounded up by the police, so Wolf was never able to ascertain how many of the burns were fatal or whether the effects were temporary or permanent. Who, if anybody, treated the victims, Wolf never knew, nor was he able to learn the source of the gas. Whether it was left over from the Japanese occupation, a counterinsurgency arm being tried by Bobby Kennedy's experimenters, or a gift from John Richardson's hated CIA team, no one ever knew. Paris papers accorded a full page to Dr. Wolf's testimony, notably Candide of August 21, 1963. Paris Press of August 17 gave the gas story half a page, while the Washington Post gave Wolf a small comer of an inner page on September 24th, without mentioning the gas victims at all. To infer that Wolf did not mention the victims while he was in Washington is to insult the American public's intelligence. The next big question, who was responsible for ordering a gas attack when by a simple gesture of conciliation Diem could have avoided, temporarily at least, the tragic train of events to follow. Americans in the vicinity of Richmond, Virginia, of which Ambassador Nalting is native, showed that regional loyalty was stronger than distrust of a Canadian-appointed ambassador. They accepted Nalting's whitewash of his friend. Dr. Wolfe testified, Candide, August 21, 1963, that officials anxious to prove their loyalty to the ruling family refused or delayed any authorization demanded by the monks. On the other hand, he wrote, I am able to state that the Catholic Church enjoyed exceptional favors. I was able to buy in the Hugh market such foodstuffs as oil, common cheese marked, not to be sold or exchanged. A gift of the American people. Such foods, turned over to Catholic organizations to be distributed gratis through the country, were sold to swell the cash reserves of the organizations. From an official in the forestry department, I learned that wood cut by the army was sold by Archbishop Fuchs, Catholic organizations. Examples abound. Fuchs, brother of the president, had exclusive control of the importation and sale of school books, which turned out to be both a profitable monopoly and an effective means of censorship. Most striking, however, was the fact that this policy had the opposite of the desired effect. With a bit of good sense, it could have been foreseen. Instead of weakening the Buddhists, such acts strengthened them. A reawakening of Buddhism resulted. Relations between monks and the people became more intense. First, the pagodas regained their ancient roles as centers of spiritual leadership. Then they began to adapt themselves to the transformation that had taken place under Ngo Dinh Diem. About a year before the crisis, they began to create a student movement, which Diem accepted with bad grace. This autocrat regarded any force independent of himself as a threat, which led him to crush and declare outlaw the sects in the South and all political opposition. Even more virulent than Diem was his sister-in-law, the beautiful Madame Ngo, who exercises strong influence on the Vietnamese government. She publicly called the monks traitors and assassins when they were peaceful. Thus there surged forth in Asia a religious fanaticism which Europe had forgotten since the Middle Ages and which in no time began to disturb the Vatican. Now, Father Vincent S. Kearney, writing in America Magazine of September 7, 1963, concerning the events that followed, stated that, in all probability, direct responsibility for the Hue affair can be laid at the door of Ngo Dinh Can. This man has no official status in the government, yet he rules central Vietnam like a Chinese warlord. It is quite possible that he gave orders for the crackdown on the demonstrations at Hue without realizing the consequence. The government's handling of the Buddhist crisis is merely a symptom of the political malaise affecting the country. South Vietnam is an ivory tower dictatorship operating in total isolation from the people it rules. It is actually more unpopular than the colonial regime of the deposed Emperor Bao Dai, for it demands much more of the people and gives them less. Though Father Francis J. Buckley wrote in the same magazine that the major motive for the repressive acts of the ideal government towards the agitation of the General Association of Buddhists is not hostility towards Buddhism, but unwillingness to accept criticism from any source. No. George Menant, Paris Match, November 23, 1963, in his expose of the delineation of power among the Ngo Dinhs and each member's role in the family monopoly that resulted, places the responsibility on Diem and Thuc. To Diem went the power, wrote Monsieur Menant, to Ngo the police, To his wife, the corruption and the deals. To Loyan, diplomacy, and to Can, the traffic in rice. Religion was the domain of Thuk. The archbishop, with his vast landholdings and personal residence, surrounded by a tower of anti-aircraft batteries. But the cardinal's hat was not the extent of Thuk's ambition. Monsignor Thuk intended to become pope. Nothing less. It is the custom of the Vatican, Menant continued, to choose the supreme pontiff from among the prelates of a country where the Catholic majority is absolute. This is why Diem published official statistics pretending that Vietnam was 70% Catholic, 20% Buddhist, and 10% diverse sects. The claim might have continued had an apostolic delegate not arrived on the scene in the midst of a Buddhist celebration, and had said delegate not observed that, in his opinion, considering the Buddhist oriflammes along his route, the 70% figure should apply to the faithful of the pagodas. Diem was furious. The flying of Buddhist banners was forbidden, and the immutable mechanism of repression that led to monks burning themselves in public was in motion. The voice of America gave only the official government explanation of events in Hue. It was all a Viet Cong provocation. On June 11, the monk Tik Quang Du burned himself alive in the center of Saigon. Other monks, including a woman adept who was none other than the mother of Prince Bu Hoi, the friend of Miss Ellen Hammer, who was then ambassador to several African countries, threatened to do likewise. While Bu Hoi was racing home to dissuade his mother, Diem and Nu set up one of their fake spontaneous demonstrations of support. This time Army veterans, supplied with trucks and sound equipment by the government, had their way cleared by police as they threatened to storm a pagoda. America was shocked. Diem and Nu were more annoyed than alarmed by the whole thing. To placate America more than the Buddhists, they sent Vice President Nguyen Ngoc Tho, himself a Buddhist, to try to soothe his coreligionists. Tho knew what a narrow margin of action he had, but he did his best. On June 15, he announced that the government would respect the liberty of the Buddhists and release the monks and their followers who had been arrested, but that it would not admit responsibility for the massacre or the use of poison gas at Hue. The official version still blamed everything on the Viet Cong. If Diem still seemed to be conciliatory, it was only in appearance. The persecutions, instead of ceasing, were stepped up. Pagodas were encircled, monks harassed and students arrested. Dr. E. Wolf later testified that the police tortured one of his students, Phan Dinh Binh, to extract his signature to a paper, accusing the Buddhist superior of working for the communists. Monks were tortured to extract similar confessions. When a German colleague of Dr. Wolf was finally permitted to see the tortured student, he was unrecognizable. 4 German doctors then officially protested the government actions and its refusal to permit the treatment of those burned by gas. When they were still prevented from fulfilling their mission as doctors, they decided to leave the country. Why Diem and Nu persisted with their repressive measures rather than trying to ease the tension is hard to explain. Some say Diem was convinced that he was winning and was determined not to lose face. Others claim that Nu counted too heavily on the support of his friend, CIA Chief John Richardson, who to date had never failed him. Ambassador Nolting, living in his ambassadorial ivory tower, may also have had something to do with it, for one must bear in mind that under Nu's efficient informer system, which pulled in any men, except News who tried to contact Americans, and with American officials willing to point out to the police any bearer of anti-Diem information. Nolting's chances of knowing the true state of affairs were very poor indeed. While Buddhists, students and opposition groups attacked America because of Nolting's blind support of the NGO Dins, and the NGO Dins charged America with inciting revolts. Who should suddenly come to the fore again in New York but Joseph Buttinger, still meddling in Vietnam affairs? One would think that the bitter experience with Diem would have taught the ardent whitewasher of Ho Chi Minh a lesson, but not at all. On June 29, 1963, Mr. Buttinger presided over a meeting in New York to decide the policy that America should follow in South Vietnam. Kennedy, looking around for someone to replace Nolting and rid him of the old policy, which was complete support of the NGO Dins, saw Henry Cabot Lodge sitting in Paris as head of a little publicized organization called the Atlantic Institute. A bright idea struck the president. He had no time to prepare the public for a volte-face. Diem had lost 2/3 of his country, and the rest was about to disintegrate in a great burst of spontaneous combustion. Something drastic had to be done in a hurry. Better to send a Republican to do it, and Lodge was the only Republican who would have taken the job. Lodge prepared to leave the sinecure, where he had been drawing up plans for an international currency in which the American dollar would be submerged for advancement of socialist one-worldism through the destruction of colonies and for American entry into a regional superstate. Suave, English-speaking General de Souzy philosophically reflected, "At last Alogy is getting to Indochina." When the war ended in Europe, he was with General de Vers. Roosevelt and Stalin had agreed at Tehran to run us Houthi Frenchy out of the Far East. Washington was already backing Ho Chi Minh, and Lodge asked to be parachuted into Indochina. There was never any doubt which side he would be on. Nay. A frenzied race with destiny seemed to seize all concerned in Saigon as the date of Lodge's arrival approached. Like the river above Niagara, the stream of events in Saigon gained momentum and swept all before it as it approached the falls. Already the inner palace coup d'etat had taken place. Diem no longer could have dumped his brother if he had wanted to, for New had assumed command and in a wild drive to end resistance before Lodge's arrival had stepped up the massive arrests of students and raids on pagodas by American armed special forces. A small dissident Buddhist group was hastily organized and accorded official recognition to convince America that Diem had Buddhist support. Likewise, a fake student front was formed to issue protestations of fidelity for publication in Jean Gregory's Times of Vietnam. When American officials tried to exonerate the Vietnamese army of responsibility for shooting into the crowd, Nhu cunningly wrung a statement of solidarity from the generals. On August 5th, a 20-year-old monk soaked himself in gasoline and burned himself at Phan Thiet, shortly after one of the country's most respected authors had committed suicide on the eve of arrest. On August 16th, a 71-year-old monk burned himself in Tu Dam Pagoda in Huet. Then came the brutal raids on the pagodas and Madame Nu's arrogant exclamation that if 50 monks barbecued themselves, she would clap her hands. On August 25th, troops drove trucks into the demonstrators in Saigon, killing and maiming as they went. At the same time, Diem and New multiplied the demonstrations intended to fool the Americans. On August 31, a monster parade was organized with some 10,000 marchers slowly filing through Saigon to counter, with their banners of loyalty and the impressiveness of their number, the growing climate of hate. What stood out throughout this force was the Hitlerism organization behind it. New's Republican youth in their dark blue uniforms, Madame U's Women's Solidarity Movement, the League of Civil Servants, all paid by Diem and Anu, and the lesser organizations which they controlled made up the parade. At this point, a phenomenon of American shallow-pan thinking appeared in all its fatuous might to provide an object lesson for political science professors for years to come, a lesson that should throw much light on America's decline. Madame New was accused of throwing oil on the fire by Gerard Marin of Paris of Figaro. London's Economist, September 14, 1963, agreed that a continued policy of repression by the regime could cause a disastrous dash, rather than a drift toward communism, by the disillusioned populace, as indeed it did. Madame New, the pampered woman who all her life, by one means or another, had attained everything her heart desired, or made a scene that shook high heaven, found herself despised by the world. Her father turned against her and resigned from his post as ambassador in Washington, stating that she was mad with power. Long-suffering Vice President Tu resigned from office and shaved his head. Word that Madame Nu's way of dealing with the monks would be to beat them 10 times as hard had traveled around the world when Vietnam's First Lady took off for the International Parliamentary Conference in Belgrade. There, Senator Margaret Chase Smith introduced her to Teddy Kennedy, stating she's quite a gal. The Belgrade sojourn started on September 11. From Belgrade, Madame Nu went to Paris, where she replied to a query about how the war was going at home. It is near its end. Only a handful of pirates are keeping it alive. As she threw out anti-French and anti-American invectives in her press conference at the Vietnamese embassy, French police held several hundred hostile Vietnamese at bay in the streets. On October 5, 2 days before Madame Nu's arrival in New York, the sixth suicide by fire in South Vietnam made headlines. Before igniting himself, the monk Quang Huan wrote to Diem, "To you, Mr. President, who sing the praises of liberty and democracy, I address these last words of a man who is about to die that he might at least cry the truth." Nah. Diem was unperturbed. To the end he refused to see or hear. Unconcerned, he opened the first session of the new National Assembly, elected by the same police state methods as all the others, and announced that the Buddhist movement had been orchestrated by communist agents, with the complicity of foreign elements. And this was the refrain Madame Nu bore to America. The reversal of American opinion that followed would have been called a miracle, had there been any truth in the premise on which it was based. Overnight, on nothing but the word of a woman whose statements Richard Starnes, New York World, Telegram, October 17, 1963, described as a charming torrent of half-truths, double talk, Oriental Goldwinisms, and an occasional out-and-out whopper. The forces in America dedicated to sound policy and common sense swung en masse to the support of Madame Nu died for over 8 years. While America's press and government had lied blatantly in the extolling of this woman, her family, and the deteriorating war in South Vietnam, barely a handful of the fringe, resentful of being described as lunatic, had ever questioned the veracity of the news they were getting. When the culprits did a turnabout to escape the consequences of their fraud, Americans, who should have held them accountable, set out in their infatuation with Madame Nu to prove that the very clique they were attacking had been right. Well-meaning citizens who, if asked to put all they knew about Vietnam on paper, could not have filled a sheet, were ready to go down fighting for what they felt, simply because, for entirely different reasons, Madame Nu was attacking the Washington administration, which they, as conservatives, distrusted. The spoiled brat of the Chuang family became their darling. On her arrival in New York, accompanied by her daughter, Madame Nu went to the Barclay Hotel at 111 East 48th Street, the same hotel where Volang and this author descended that April day, 8 years before, as bearers of fresh, important information to keep American support behind Diem through just this last crisis. A host of such emissaries had passed through New York on their way to Washington in the intervening years. But gradually this technique, like all ploys, suffered from the law of diminishing returns, and at the end of the road, faced bankruptcy. It was then that Diem and Nu played their big card, the woman who had charmed embassy officials and CIA operators alike into underwriting the dying regime through all its vicissitudes. So deeply was charged affairs, Randolph Kidder involved, in the eyes of Southeast Asia, that, by the time, is the assignment to the American embassy in Hanoi, Saigon, ended. He was never referred to by your name. but always as Madame New Man in the American Embassy. .ic. There is a no IBM machine to calculate the wall cost to America of what the day Paris Diplomatic Weekly. Oh, accounts. November 8, 1963. Headlined as Madame Neu's use of eroticism in the service of politics. When Madame New reached America for her tour, that was to take her from coast to coast, through 12 cities for at least 17 local or national radio and TV appearances, 17 lectures and 15 lunches or dinners, Randolph Kidder was not there to greet her. He had been sent on a trip around the world, inspecting U.S. embassies, and Gere Biddle Duke rented Mr. Harl Kidder's house on Foxhall Road in Washington for the time he would have to be away. Back in Vietnam, things were going from bad to worse. On October 19th, 150 miles from Saigon, the National Army had suffered its most humiliating defeat since Paperback. In the course of it, 13 Americans were killed or wounded. On October 26, D entertained the UN fact-finding mission. W. Nishi had isolated, and whose movements Nu's secret police were shielding, as though they were contagious. The occasion was the 8th anniversary of the police state referendum so admired by Senator Mansfield, which had deposed Bao Dai and made Diem president. Next day, another monk burned himself near Saigon's Catholic cathedral. The 28th of October brought another smashing military defeat in the Delta. But the heavy conspiracy of censorship, both Vietnamese and American, prevented all this from ever reaching the American people. During this period, Cabot Lodge was giving parties in honor of Vietnamese officers. Colonels and generals began gathering on the ambassador's tennis court. When Diem wanted to see him, Mr. Lodge was always too busy, which was more and more true, observed George Menant. Paris match, November 23, 1963. Sensing that a storm was approaching, that Washington's unquestioning support was slipping, Diem humbled himself to the point of offering to go to the embassy himself. "Impossible, Monsieur le Président," replied Mr. Lodge on the telephone. "You know that would be contrary to protocol." Nu, the real master of the country, had already long been negotiating with the communists. Joe, also, his greatest apologist and sycophant, went so far as to admit in the Washington Post of September 21 that Nu had received overtures from the North Vietnamese, from which Alsop exonerated him by calling them French-sponsored. When it was all over, and denial of Nu's perfidy no longer possible, Alsop wrote on May 15, 1964, that the unbalanced Nu had begun negotiations for a dry deal with the North Vietnamese communists in the Ligamano Entity last months before his now death. Nightel and the Yule again. Alsop adroitly evaded responsibility for his ISOL 9 years of fawning praise by adding that secret French intrigue was responsible, and besides Nu had changed. So, actually, in the fall of 1963, while New negotiated with the Reds behind our backs. His fiery wife insulted the intelligence of America's conservatives with wild statements about the fight she and her husband were waging against communism. "The war is being won," she said. "Stay with us just a little longer." To please Americans who distrusted the Kennedy administration, she added, "One does not need an enemy if one has America for a friend." Chapter 23. The Explosion. South Vietnam's elegantly gowned First Lady with the vicious tongue paused in Chicago on October 23, 1963, to telephone her husband, whose special forces had just clubbed and arrested a few hundred more Vietnamese clamoring for his ousting. What lay in store for those arrested the Saigon public knew only too well. Many had brothers and cousins in the Army and Air Force. "When are you coming back?" New asked his wife. "Around the 29th. I'll come by way of Japan." "I'll come to meet you. Be careful that they don't think you are running away." It was no facetious remark. Paris press had reported as far back as September 1 that the NGO Dins were packing their treasure. New made no reply. 4 days later, he called his wife in San Francisco. They discussed her forthcoming operation for a cyst on the eye. Gossip had it that she was having wrinkles removed. New advised her to go back to Los Angeles for the operation. "Are you coming to meet me in Japan?" she asked. "No." "Why?" "You yourself told me not to come." "No. I said not to come if conditions were unfavorable, are they?" "I'm not coming," was all New said. His wife, later, said that she sensed that his confidence in himself was slipping. Actually, New and Diem were still convinced that they would come out on top, for was not American aid still pouring into the country? Up in Delat, an Institute of Nuclear Research was inaugurated on October 30. Heads of International Pipe and Ceramics Company of East Orange, New Jersey, were rubbing their hands over a $5,600,000 order for a 15-mile pipeline from the Dong Nai River to Saigon. The Hydrotechnic Corporation of New York was racing to complete a $7,144,000 water treating plant for Saigon, while a $9,207,700 sewage disposal system was also under construction. How generous was the nation that, after World War II, denied its own citizens passports until they could pay for food furnished them in Japanese prison camps. Joe Alsop insists that the communist offensive was slowed down during this period because of the negotiations going on between them and New. Others have reasoned that Ho Chi Minh wanted to give America time to complete the fine roads and installations we were preparing for him. Again, it may have been that the offensive did not let up at all, that censorship alone was responsible for the illusion that our side was holding firm. On October 34, companies of the American paid special forces, with which New had maintained his grip on the capital, were moved out of Saigon to go through the motions of opposing the Viet Cong. This, New had been assured by his friends on the American team, would permit them to resume paying the $300,000 a month he had been receiving for their support. To offset the temporary loss of the four companies, Diem called in some 10 loyal troops and placed them under the command of his military governor, General Tan That Dinh. For Diem and New Hu were convinced that such a show of force would discourage any plotters. Admiral Felt, U.S. commander in the Pacific, made his farewell call at the palace at 11:30 a.m. accompanied by Ambassador Lodge to say goodbye to the president before returning to America. Lodge had been scheduled to leave the same day, but at the last minute announced that his trip had been postponed till the following Saturday. "My services inform me," Diem told his visitors, "that there are rumors of a movement being prepared against me. No doubt they are only trial balloons being launched by irresponsible agents of your CIA." Lodge and the admiral made no reply. While they were at the palace, all of the generals in the area who were considered Diem men were arriving at the headquarters of the general staff for a very special lunch. General Levan Tui, the old fox who had betrayed General Hin in September 1954 and served as emissary between the rules and the palace in November 1960, had been smart enough to know long in advance that something was afoot and to get out of the capital for reasons of health. This left in command 46-year-old General Tran Van Don, a corps commander who had had some success against the communists, but who had been removed from field command by Yin Hu in December 1962 because he was suspected of being one of the officers who wanted reforms in Saigon as a prime requisite to winning the war. Don had summoned Diem's generals for the luncheon and conference, and at 1:30 he calmly told them that the army was seizing power and that they were under arrest. Diem and Nu were taking their siesta in the palace as this was going on. The chief of the Surate had phoned Nu earlier when the troop movement started that morning, but Nu reassured him. "Don't worry," said he. "It's a plan of mine." When 3 command battalions cut the road to the airport, the police chief began to have doubts. Then, a detachment of Marine infantry took over the police headquarters, and he knew something was afoot. Again he called the palace. This time, Diem phoned his faithful military governor-general and was told by an aide that the governor was not in. While they were talking, rebel forces were occupying the arsenal and the radio station. At 1:45, the heavy, humid air of Saigon was shaken by shots. Supported by tanks, the insurgents started occupying all the city. Colonel Nguyen Ngo Khoi, commanding the Presidential Guard, prepared to hold off the attackers, beginning to ring the palace. Again, Diem tried to contact his military governor Antidolwa, failing to reach him, concluded that he had been arrested. Little knowing that the governor, who the day after the brutal assault on the pagodas had saved Diem's face by swearing that the army was united to a man behind the president, had been flattered into joining the plot. Shortly after 3:00 p.m. an announcement came over the radio that 14 generals and 10 colonels had delivered an ultimatum to Diem and his brother to surrender. Within the palace, the procedure that had worked so well on November 11, 1960, was being repeated. Over the bunker radio, Diem and Nu began calling regional commanders to come to their rescue. The generals replied that they would obey the orders of the general staff. Then Nu called for provincial governors to rush their civilian guards to his aid. Hour after hour, the appeals from the bunker continued, always farther and farther afield, and Nu waited in vain. He and his brother had tried their game once too often and were to learn, to their sorrow, the cost of the wave of revenge they had unleashed the last time troops had saved them. General Duong Van Min, Big Min, they called him, showed himself by mid-afternoon as leader of the putsch. The same Min who, as a colonel 7.5 years before, had acquired his star as general of brigade by destroying the Hoa Hao and the Bin Yen for Diem in the Battle of Rungsat, thereby opening their vast areas to the communists. Another coincidence was not overlooked, as the war of religion between Diem and the Buddhists seemed likely to rip the country asunder. It was Diem's American advisors, the meddlers from Michigan State, Iron Mike O'Daniel and Colonel Edward Lansdale, the political officer with the poison, mimeograph, who first introduced the religious factor into Vietnamese politics with their playing of Diem and his Nung tribe mercenaries against the Co Dai and the Hoa Hao. Sometime during the afternoon of October 31st, Cabot Lodge is reported to have telephoned the palace and offered Diem safe conduct out of the country. "I refuse," Diem is said to have replied, "but know that I appreciate your great thoughtfulness." As night fell, the two brothers, trapped in the bunker beneath the Jie Long Palace, were still appealing for help. Again, the insurgents called on them to surrender. Again, they refused, and the order to charge was given. 10 M24 tanks opened a breach in the wall. Albert Pham Ngoc Thao, Joe Alsop's hero, the man whom Time magazine of April 12, 1961, glorified for getting Diem re-elected, had known when to jump. One might imagine Thao was fighting for his own life, and Diem's as this struggle was going on. Not at all. As head of new secret police, Thao knew when the game was up, and saved his skin by changing sides. He spent the night broadcasting diatribes against his late master. Madame Nu, following the battle in Beverly Hills with her ears glued to a radio, said nothing against her husband's right-hand man, but stepped up her tirades against the Americans. It is true, the storming of the palace was an affair that the young hotheads of UCS and CIA should have stayed out of. European papers told of American advisors entering Jialong Palace with the first wave of troops. Young Americans in civilian clothes, wearing baseball caps and talking incessantly into walkie-talkies as they moved from one unit to another among the attacking forces. Correspondents wrote of American photographers, whom they had never seen before and who did not use their cameras, accompanying each advancing wave. At 3:00 a.m., Vietnamese Marines massed for a final assault some 240 feet from the palace. An hour later, 2 T-28 planes made strafing passes, and at 4:15 the attack was ordered. As each room was cleared, a white sheet was hung from the window so that artillery fire outside would cease. The last message from the radio in the bunker was monitored about 4 a.m. All else had failed, and Nu, at the end of his rope, played his last card. He called on his Republican youth and the women's militia, organized by his wife, to go into the streets and save them. There was no reply, nothing but silence. The last highly paid rats had left the ship. The palace was empty when the search for the two brothers began. Later it was learned that they had escaped through a tunnel leading to the home of a Chinese who had long served as a cover for NU and was in that spot for just such an occasion. To the end, the brothers never lost their cunning. As Marvin Liebman, the friend of Diem's public relations huckster, had so truthfully put it, Diem's hatred of the Chinese was a pathological thing. So a Chinese home would be the last place where Diem's enemies would expect to find his tunnel. And it was through the house of Mai Tuyen, the Chinese, that they escaped in the early hours of November 1 to the Church of St. Francis of Xavier in Cholon, the Chinese city, Le Van Vien's old center of vice and pleasure, the city from whence Nu had sent Le Van Vien's son to his death 7 years before. For about an hour the two brothers remained in prayer. An armored car drew up outside. At 10:15 the Saigon radio announced that they had committed suicide while being transferred to Army headquarters. Fantastic versions of their death began sweeping the town. A Vietnamese sergeant showed their stained jackets and said that Dime had been killed by a bullet in the back of the head, but that Nu had been stabbed in the back. Another story had it that Nu flew into a rage and was shot when he lunged for a gun. Georges Chafford, Indochine Dix and Est de l'Independence, gives a version according to which Nu let himself be taken because he was deprived of his opium. Street gossipers claimed that the brothers knew too much about the USA's and CIA boys who had worked with them, and that they were murdered to seal their tongues. Among the shattered telephones on Inhu's desk lay an open book, entitled Shoot to Kill, which he had been studying before he went to sleep. The full story will eventually come out. To date, however, it has never been established who actually killed Diem and Ho, much as it would please many Americans to read that embassy officials, CIA in and US's liberals who had bolstered this family since 1954 were also guilty of murdering them. The author does not, in all honesty, believe that America's high-handed plotters ordered the murder. Granted, had Diem and Nu not been killed, a trial would have followed. And at the trial, the real defendants in the witness box, as the crimes of the NGO Dins against their people were brought to light, would be the Americans who imposed them. Labor leaders dictating policy. The Michigan State University revolutionaries. Mike Mansfield, Joseph Bottinger, Angier Biddle-Duke, and the distinguished guests of John D. Rockefeller's May 11, 1957, luncheon. But no order to assassinate the Ngo Dins was necessary. There was not a family in Saigon that had not discussed in whispers the fate of a friend or a relative, and an anti-communist one at that, who had disappeared into the dungeon in the Botanical Gardens or some other of New's prisons. The American public had never been told of these things, and what paper, after singing the praises of the Ngo Dins for 8 years, was likely to say, "We lied to you. Here is the true story." So the sympathy of America's conservatives surged to the widow, but heaped anathema on the men who had given her power and enriched her and, when the game became embarrassing, dropped her. A French journalist dryly observed, "Madame Ambition is now Madame Revenge." It is often the case, and certainly it was with Ambassador Nalting, that those outside of a beleaguered capital know more of what is going on than do those within. In Hugh, Brother Ken, the ruthless grafter generally referred to as the gangster of the family, knew long in advance that the end was near. Ken eased his iron rule several weeks before his brothers were killed, when General Du Ko Tre, commander of the 4th Military Region, went to his villa to arrest him, and at the same tune save him from being massacred. Ken had taken refuge in the American consulate, which, in view of Khan's conduct in Hugh, could hardly refuse to hand him over. For one day a short dispatch appeared in the American press, announcing the discovery of mass graves and underground dungeons in Khan's stronghold. Then silence. Americans never heard of them again. Khan was flown back to Saigon, tried and executed, but a deal had been concluded, it was said, between General Min's followers and the Americans. The Vietnamese were accorded NN's scalp, but charges against him were held down to a minimum, just enough to convict him without embarrassing America. So little of what Khan had done in his days of unbridled power ever reached the American public. A great storm of protest rose from shocked sentimentalists who, on the other side of the world, and dependent on Time magazine for information, could not see why he was being executed. Americans who a short time before had been outraged over the brutality of the raids on Buddhist temples and the horror of the suicides did a turnabout overnight and turned their ire on their own government for not perpetuating what had shocked, using the fate of Demon Hu and Khan's execution as ammunition against the Kennedy left. However, entailed blanket acceptance of Madame Nu's statement that the Buddhist monks were nothing but communists in saffron robes, so accept her statement they did. It was surface, thinking America's good conservatives devoted to events in Saigon, the searching study that a people anxious to avoid being called kooks and lunatics should apply to every move before leaping into it. They could have built up a much more damning case, for the crime lay in choosing this family in the first place, putting it in power, refusing to let the Vietnamese topple our proteges while change was yet possible, and then permitting our team to wash their hands of responsibility when the coming explosion threatened to compromise. There is no doubt that communist agitators were active among the monks and students, for the Viet Cong were as wily as the NUS. If the police state rule of Diem and U and the stupidity or intent of the small group of Americans supporting it created a climate ideal for communist agitation, not the communists, should be blamed when the communists exploit it. All this was overlooked, however, by California's young Republicans, who flocked to take up the beautiful Haradinois degree M.A. French writer who knew her once described as one of God's slies. That her father had closed his door on her was brushed off. When she cried, the United States wanted to crush the leaders legally elected by the Vietnamese people, they stood entranced, as though she were Joan of Arc. Had they but known it, the truth would have served their campaign against Kennedy and his planners so much better. Leaving between $11,000 and $14,000 in debt behind her, and swearing never to set foot in the country again, Madame Nu, accompanied by her daughter Letou, took off for Rome in a blaze of fury to join her brother-in-law, the Archbishop. While her other daughter and 2 sons were being flown to Rome to join her, those whom she and her husband had dispossessed began streaming home from their places of exile. Colonel Nguyen Chan Thi, who led the November 1960 paratrooper revolt, returned from 3 years of indigence and boredom in Cambodia. Ngo and Ton Hoan, the Dai Viet leader, and General Du of the Defiant Proclamation, flew back from Paris. Hoin San Thong, the Dai Viet Party member, whom U.S. information agency had hounded out of one job after another, including a job with a supposedly independent newsreel company, because of the letter he wrote predicting what was to happen, left his job at Yale University and headed for home. Saigon, in a delirium of joy reminiscent of Paris on its delivery from the Germans, danced in the streets. Tran Trong Dung, Ngo's nephew by marriage and husband of that same Madame Dung who in a Paris restaurant the year before had wondered why her family did not get out while they could, quietly buried Diem and Nu in the cemetery of Phu Nguyen on the evening of November 3rd died. For Madame Nu, the big adventure was over. The bitterness of unimportance in a luxurious apartment on Avenue Charles Fouquet, in Paris' most fashionable arrondissement, lay ahead. For Vietnam, the long war period had definitely ended, and the short campaign was underway. Big Min set up a revolutionary committee to rule the country pending new and honest elections. The American press sang his praises and, surface-wise, all looked bright for the moment. But what was to follow after the first days of exultation should have been expected. The team, who had been responsible for the shambles, were still anonymous because of a servile press, and there was no reason why the debacle in Saigon should drive them to shelter. Already they were at work to thwart the Vietnamese, who had earned a chance at power, and to ease into office one government after another of non-entities, from whom Ho Chi Minh would eventually seize control. Plans for the build-up of Albert Pham Minh Ngoc Thao as eventual heir to the Ngo Dins were already discernible, despite the fact that Thao was responsible for much of the country's hatred of that family. Still repeating the mistake they had made with Diem, the team in Washington rushed to Saigon a man named Nguyen Xuan Oan, whom some unstated agency or private group, or Angier Biddledukes International Rescue Committee, had wafted to America after World War II, when America was glamorizing Ho Chi Minh. Owen had been out of his country for 15 years, studying at Harvard, teaching economics at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and even acquiring, so it was said, American nationality. The UN employed him for a while. It was evident that he never warned the entrenched clique leading America downhill that their Diem experiment was going to be disastrous, since he never earned their enmity. Unknown, though he was in Vietnam, and certain to be despised for having remained comfortably in America while the going was rough, the high-handed little group in Washington that had been running Vietnam as they pleased picked up Nguyen Xuan, nicknamed Jack Owens, and sent him home. It may have been the same group that brought him to America in the first place. A web of unfathomable intrigue surrounds almost every phase of the meddling in South Vietnam. When joy at being liberated subsided, the honeymoon was over, and the public turned on Minh for retaining Diem's creatures. Premier, though, was the first to be sacrificed, since he had never had support from anyone but Diem. Thereupon Nguyen Xuan Oan was dubbed Premier by the American team, with no more formalities or mandate than when Diem had made the vice president. As a sop to the Dai Viet Party, which had been persecuted by both Diem and his American backers all those years, Nguyen Ton Hon was given the rank, mainly honorific, of vice premier. When Hon saw that his hands were tied, he resigned, completely unobserved by the general public. As all this manipulation was going on, was Albert Pham Ngoc Thao, who had successfully made the switch from intelligence chief, for the communists to commander of unused secret police. When New fell to a top spot among Diem's and Mu's assassins, Thou was potentially the most dangerous man in the country. Not only was his record of communist atrocities shocking, and his capacity for treachery boundless, but the force at his disposal was an underground one. Since, no doubt at Thou's orders, New's 70,000-member network of killers and informers had ignored New's appeal to go into the streets. They were neither broken up nor exposed, and Thou was still their leader. Both he and they were bound together more firmly than ever if they were to save their own necks. But of all this time, and the American press said nothing, and Washington was silent. Wow! Out in the field, units of the Ho-Au-How and the CIO sects, whom Diem and his American advisors had been fighting since mid-1955 as communists, came in to make their peace, and officials for the first time admitted that they had been anti-communist all along. For a day or so, stories of Kai-Dai and Hoa-Hei-Hao cooperation against the Reds appeared. Then silence. Big Min, the man whom the sects were expected to accept as their new chief, was the same Min who, with American advisors directing his artillery fire, had broken them in 1955. And there were the followers of Le Bon Vivant, who had been communism's ruthless enemies. Big Min and the Americans would not let Le Bon Vivant come back at all. If Vice President Tho was unacceptable as a civilian chief of state, who would head the new Vietnam? Hanoi, Saigon, Washington, and Paris simultaneously posed this question. Here we have one of the most significant contradictions of the Vietnam fiasco. At least it is a contradiction if we are to assume that the aim of Americans who made South Vietnam their private affair was anything other than a Ho Chi Minh victory. Hanoi assumed that America would get behind the one Vietnamese with a party and a known determination to win the war. Accordingly, Hanoi launched a campaign against Nguyen Thanh Huong. That America should back anyone else seemed inconceivable to Ho Chi Minh's Central Committee. A 103-page booklet entitled Saigon at the Hour of Coups d'État was rushed out by Ho's foreign language editions, pressed to destroy Han by labeling him the warmongering puppet of the American. In Washington, however, two recognized conservatives came out with a column of inside information on November 9, 1963, just 8 days after the Diem and Nhu assassination, which could only have been slipped to them by someone determined to block Han. No better example exists of the way in which the international left profits by the lack of communication among the world's disunited conservatives to play them against each other than the manner in which Allen and Scott were led into using a line that would be effective in America to knife the man whom humanized. The French communist Daily had torpedoed as pro-American and a warmonger, Theo Manet, February 27, 1962. Wrote Allen and Scott, remember the name of Nguyen Thanh Huong. He is the man to keep an eye on in the seething South Vietnamese cauldron. Huong had just resigned as vice premier and seemed likely to move in as president or premier in a matter of weeks. They continued, Huong is head of the Democratic League of Vietnam, with headquarters in New Haven. Actually, Huong headed the Dai Viet, Great Land or Great Viet Party. Neither it nor Dr. Huong were headquartered in New Haven. Huong's friend and party member Mr. Huong San Thong had been working at Yale University. It will be recalled, since his discharge from a job with the State Department in February 1956, for writing letters to the Christian Science Monitor and the Washington Post, predicting what has since happened in his country, and his discharge from News of the Day by order of the U.S. Information Agency. The next untruth, a leftist-leaning politician, Huong was sent into exile by the late President Diem for anti-American activities. He is credited with favoring the establishment of a so-called coalition government to seek unity with communist-ruled North Vietnam. The exact opposite was true of Ho's violent anti-communism and his coup d'etat attempt against Ho Chi Minh in 1946. Allen and Scott knew nothing. As regards the sent into exile statement, it will be recalled that U.S. Ambassador Donald Heath gave Hon his visa and sent him to Washington to tell his story, after which Hon did not dare go home. The coalition government and unity with communist-ruled North Vietnam were likewise part of the hatchet job. The advocate of such a solution was Hon's mortal enemy, former Premier Tran Van Hue, currently working with the Vietnamese communist Nguyen Minh Ha, son-in-law of a French communist deputy named Moran. Several months ago, the State Department gave Hon a visa to come to the U.S. From Paris, Allen and Scott continued. He was there in the early days of the Buddhist protests. Two Saigon leaders of that stormy anti-Diem movement are close associates of Hon. They are Tam Shao and Tri Quang. True, after refusing Hon entry into America since 1956, the State Department issued him a visa when they decided to get out from under Diem. Like all former cabinet members and opposition leaders, Hon had maintained contact with the Buddhists who were also dissatisfied with America's man, though Hon himself is a Catholic. A fact which the same American agents using Allen and Scott to torpedo Hon in Washington were holding up to Buddhists in Saigon as an argument against him. The last Allen and Scott paragraph was meant to polish off the victim once and for all. After leaving Hanoi University in 1940, Hon was tied up with French intelligence. The truth is, Hon left Hanoi University in 1945, delayed by the war dart. In 1939, he founded the first section of the Dai Viet Party within the university. In 1943, communist killers made 2 attempts to assassinate him because of his disintoxication project to unbrainwash communist students. That same year, probably on a communist tip-off, since they often used that way of getting an enemy, Hon was arrested by the Japanese. Released, he was hunted by the Japs again in 1944 and went underground. In 1945, he was tracked by the French because his Dai Viet Party, claiming independence, was considered subversive. 3 weeks after Allen and Scott's gratuitous hatchet job on the one-man Hanoi wanted destroyed, it was the turn of the Washington World. On December 2, 1963, the World told its readers, although officially they are happy with the new government in South Vietnam, veteran U.S. diplomats are chary over the political vacuum created by the overthrow of the Diem regime. One reason, Nguyen Ton Hoan, a left-leaning politician who had been living in exile in New Haven, Connecticut, as head of the Democratic League of Vietnam, may well be sucked into the leadership vacuum. If so, there could be much agitation to unify South Vietnam with North Vietnam. Any anti-and communist authority on Vietnam. Piecing these diverse moves together can arrive at only 2 assumptions. Americans in Washington and Saigon who had left no stone unturned to ruin Hoan and destroy his party during the years of all-out support for Diem were determined that the man they had come to regard as a personal enemy was not going to get in. Or they were out to deliver the country to Ho Chi Minh by seeing that no one capable of fighting Ho Chi Minh should rise to power. In January 30, 1964, Big Minh was overthrown and a Buddhist general, Nguyen Khan, took over. Minh's Revolutionary Committee was replaced by Khan's Revolutionary Council, and overnight America took up the praises of Khan. Again, serious students of the situation had misgivings. Khan, brother of a communist official named Nguyen Long, had become Diem's fair-haired boy during the November 11, 1960, coup d'etat attempt by making his way into the palace, taking command of the Presidential Guard and holding out until Tran Thien Kim could betray his comrades and become a brigadier general by bringing up his tanks. Thereafter, Khan and Kim could do anything. Khan sat on the general staff, but as Diem's favorite, he took orders from Diem alone, ignored the chain of command, and went his own freewheeling way. When he replaced Min, it may have pleased the Hoa Hao and the Xiao Dai, but in the overall picture, there was no improvement. The paratroopers over whom Khan and Kim walked to advancement in November 1960 hated the new team as fiercely as the sects hated the old one. What a basket of eels was this nation, about which every hoodwinked and lied to American thought he knew everything. Chaos reigned. Buddhists, drunk with the headiness of power after 9 years on the receiving end, rapidly lost all the sympathy their just grievances and suicides had brought. The climate for communist agitation was perfect. On February 2, rioting students, as intoxicated with their own importance as the Buddhists, made trouble till Khan took Big Min back into his government. The truth of the law of physics that every swing of the pendulum is followed by an equal and opposite reaction was never better illustrated. But watching this anarchy from across the ocean and applying an explanation to fit their wishes, Americans by the thousands accepted the fallacious premise that, until Diem and Nu were killed, our side was winning. Great lawyers who would never have taken a case without thoroughly studying the background flocked to the defense of Manu. Catholics and Catholic journals took up the cause of the NGO Dins because they were Catholic, and Protestant conservatives because, in the last 2 minutes of the game, and then only, the most arrogant group of planners that ever misdirected a nation had decided to take their distance from the LDO Din. On March 23, 1964, and for that day only, an AP report a little over 2 inches long appeared in an inside page of the New York News. Most papers failed to print it at all. Assets illegally acquired by Diem and the NUS had gone on display in Saigon the previous day. Included were photographs of the elegant bathroom in Madame Nu's sumptuous home in Dalat. The loot exhibited was appraised at some $20 million, or over $2,300,000 for each year that Diem and Nu had held power. This, of course, represented only such assets as had not been shipped out of the country by the family that had nothing in June 1954, when Bao Dai gave Diem a check for 1 million piastres to hire Klan. The assets of shipping companies, construction enterprises, real estate and fishing firms, sugar, wine, rice and cinnamon houses, etc. trade, concealed through Yu's arrangements with businessmen fronting for him, had already been confiscated. 3 months before, caught between the devil and the deep blue sea in this tracking down of accomplices was poor Mai Tuan, the Chinese whose house sheltered the escape end of Dime's tunnel. Despite everything the Angio Dins had done to his people, Mai Tuan, to stay in business, had to put up with anything Hu and Diem demanded, even to the Vietnamization of his name. Had he denounced them the morning of their escape, he could have saved his property, but who could be sure even then that the family would not come out on top? In the end, Mai Tuan's belongings were confiscated along with the property he covered for honest Diem and his brother. Pandemonium was the best word for Saigon as 1964 unfolded. On August 17, Khan again drove out Min and had a junta name him chief of state. Out in the streets again came rioting Buddhists and Vietnam's new beatnik student class. On August 25, Khan tore up the charter voted by his junta and stepped down from the presidency to prevent further disorder. There was a pause. For a moment it appeared that the day Nguyen Tan Hon and the day Viet had been awaiting for 25 years was at hand. Then something happened. That America had a hand in it would seem evident from the viciousness of the campaign against Hon's assuming the presidency. Hon was summarily driven out of the country to Hong Kong, and on September 3 General Khan returned to what might, by a stretch of the term, be called power. Actually, it was anarchy. The first intimation of what was afoot came in a dispatch out of Saigon by Warren Rogers, Washington Bureau Chief of Hearst, Headline Service, on September 21, 1964. Who Washington, and Hanoi were out to destroy we already know. Hearst's Washington bureau chief furnished the first clue as to who was on the upgrade. It was Albert Pham Engok. Of all the far-out sorties of newsmen into the outer space beyond common sense, no report given the American public since the Vietnam hoax began was ever so when you own insulting to the or public's intelligence, or less able to stand up under analysis. Then Warren Rogers, September 21, efforting to make a fine fellow out of a communist breaker of men. It will be remembered that when Thao headed Ho Chi Minh's intelligence, the toughest legionnaires, with reason, regarded death as preferable to capture. In September, Major General Duong Van Du had led his troops on Saigon in an abortive coup d'etat. He made 3 demands on the government, the first of which was the elimination of Albert Pham Ngoc Thao, whose ruthlessness for the communists Du had personally experienced as a prisoner. Warren Rogers poohed it as the petty gripe of a coward against a fine officer who did his duty. No sentimental nonsense about the underdog was permitted to interfere with the new line. Those watching the writhing of the Vietnam basket of eels and the sinuous turnings of American policy with any knowledge of the actors involved murmured, "This is it," and waited for the next development. On October 1 it came. Colonel Albert Pham Ngoc Thao was appointed press attaché to the Vietnamese embassy in Washington. With him, as ambassador, went Lieutenant General Tran Thien Kim, the godson of Diem, who had been Senator Mike Mansfield's godson when the going was good. By coincidence or logical train of events, depending on the realism of the viewer. Shortly after New's former secret police chief and Diem Godson reached Washington in their new capacities, all the bills Madame New left behind her in America, somewhere between $11.00 and $14.00, were quietly paid. There was another coincidence, as the disastrous summer of 1964 drew to a close in the September maneuverings in Saigon to get Kim and Thao appointed to Washington as ambassador and press attaché, respectively, unfolded. At that very moment, senators in far-off Washington were obediently approving the Johnson-Rusk appointment of Randolph Kidder as United States ambassador to Cambodia. Now, it will be recalled that Diem's invasion of Cambodia in June 1958 was responsible for Cambodia's swing toward Peking, and Randolph Kidder, regarded in Southeast Asia as the foremost of Madame New favorites, was held responsible for our continuing support of Diem. So naming Kidder ambassador to Cambodia was nothing more nor less than a last push to shove vital Cambodia the rest of the way into Peking's arms, if that were necessary. How to estrange allies and win friends for our deadliest enemy seems our greatest talent. Not an American paper expressed anything but surprise when Cambodia refused to permit Randolph Kidder to enter the country. On December 6, Thao's wife, Pham Dinh, the longtime communist militant and sister of the communist professor, Pham Thu, joined her husband with her 4 children. The capital where the fanatic Red had found herself still claimed to be the torchbearer for liberty in Southeast Asia, and continued to sacrifice several young Americans a day to convince America's patriotic citizens it was true. But a change was in the air. Senator Mansfield, the stubborn Montanan most responsible for South Vietnam's defeat by despair, the member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, who would not consider anyone but his man when a change could have been made, overnight began talking about negotiations, a euphemism for surrender. When confronted by the anarchy he, more than any other senator, had made inevitable by encouraging destruction of every man and group capable of assuring stability, Senator Mansfield piously observed, the Vietnamese should realize that it is their country and their war. Had the good senator only realized it 10 years sooner, all might have been so different. The New York Times told its readers on November 22, 1964, that a pair of folk singers who have all been touring American college campuses by conventional transportation will soon be touring the South back villages of Vietnam by helicopter. News reporter Robert Shelton continued to tell how the State Department was sending Bill Crofute and Steve Addis abroad on their second such government-backed junket as a sort of two-man musical Peace Corps. Vietnam, Laos, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Kenya were to be their destinations. On a previous trip, they sang for Burmese students in a communist school and were made honorary tribesmen in Kenya. On the subject of opposition to communism, all we know is what we read in the New York Times, said Mr. White. Crowfoot. We don't want to get involved in any power struggle. We are out to give Asians a different picture of Americans. So American defense of liberty had become a power struggle. When two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers, was E-Way Messrs. Crowfoot and Addis summed up their line neutralism, not encouragement that Vietnamese warn and assist American officers behind the barbed wire of bases about to be attacked. Was the policy Addis and Crowfoot were being flown Vietnam and helicoptered from village to village. The best picture to be found of America's disastrous four-stage tragedy in South Vietnam is provided by spreading 4 issues of magazine out on a table. In 1946 came the Ho Chi Minh phase, with Harold R. Isaacs singing Ho's praises as the George Washington of Southeast Asia, the man who kept life in his frail body only by his purity of aim and singleness of purpose. Obscenities were heaped on French officers who opposed him. In January 1956, Harper's accorded Senator Mansfield space for the lauding of Ngo Dien Del. Times had changed, and Holine was out. Then came Harper's of September 1962. It was time to disclaim responsibility for Diem. So Professor Stanley Millay was provided with a press to tell Harper's short, memoried readers about terror in Vietnam, an American's ordeal at the hands of our friends. In Harper's of December 1964, 18 years after Harold Isaac's passionate plea for Ho, Harper's patient editors completed the circle and published a call by Joseph Kraft, ex-propagandist for the Algerian FN, to get out of Vietnam and let North and South negotiate between themselves. If one read the signs correctly, and they were many, America's post-war protégé, Ho Chi Minh, was about to win out in the end. There was no resolute last-hour girding for American victory. Desperate American advisers, watching protected guerrillas and unhindered raiders wipe out experienced officers and young West Pointers with impunity, cried for unity, anything that would provide a semblance of a rallying point. David Schönbrunn, who, on September 30, 1956, in Collier's, trumpeted for Diem to not only remove Bao Dai, but do it in such a way that he no longer has any usefulness as a symbol of Vietnamese unity, had by 1964 washed his hands of the whole affair, and was busy burrowing elsewhere. How did we ever get involved in South Vietnam? A public capable only of apathy or indignation awakened to cry. Was it for this that we people were bled white, our gold reserves squandered, and our dollar brought to the brink of collapse? The answer, bluntly, is yes. A senseless, stupid crusade against colonialism agreed upon by Roosevelt and Stalin at Tehran led us up to our waists in the quagmire of Indochina. Determination to replace the allies we were ousting drew us in the rest of the way. A 1-hour carrier-based airstrike could have destroyed Ho Chi Minh's decimated army in March 1954, saved the beleaguered garrison at Dien Bien Phu, and changed the course of history. But there was a virus in the bloodstream of America that desired a Viet Minh triumph. The story of Indochina is the story of the decline of the West. Only an informed public, such as America did not have on November 3, 1964, will bring the victory at the polls, which alone will eradicate the virus and prevent many more Indochinas to come. All the force of America's massed left, from the White House down, are regimented to silence those who would tell America the truth. Appendix. Important dates. 1925. Bao Dai, 12 years old, a student in France, becomes Emperor of Vietnam upon the death of his father. 1929. The Communist Party of Indochina is founded. 1939. World War II begins. The Dai Viet Party is founded by Nguyen Thanh Hon. 1940. France falls to Germany. French Indochina, loyal to the Vichy government in France, comes under Japanese domination. 1945. March. Japan ends French rule in Vietnam. Bao Dai proclaims the independence of Vietnam. August. Hiroshima Day. VJ Day. Communist Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh effectively take over Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh forces Bao Dai to abdicate. September. France begins to re-establish her rule in Vietnam. 1946. An 8-year war between France and the Communist Viet Minh begins. Bao Dai escapes from Ho Chi Minh, flies to Nanking. 1948. Bai Vien, the pirate, brings his band to the side of France against the Communists. 1049. Bao Dai returns as Chief of State of Vietnam. 1950. Communist China begins large-scale military aid to the Viet Minh. Bai Vien acquires the Grand Monde, the great gambling monopoly, builds up a private force that is the terror of the Reds. The United States increases aid to the French. 1952. June. Nguyen Phan Thom, father of Nguyen Van Hin, replaces Tran Van Hu as premier. 1953. May Henri Navarre becomes French military commander in Vietnam. November. The French occupy Dien Bien Phu. 1954. Bai Vien becomes General of An Vien and head of the Saigon Police. April 26th. In Geneva, the Conference on Indochina opens. May 7. Dien Bien Phu falls to the Communists. June 15. Ngo Dien Diem takes office as Premier of South Vietnam. July 21st. The Geneva Agreement is signed giving North Vietnam to the Communists. July. Refugees begin to stream from North to South Vietnam. September. Nguyen Van Hien, Chief of Staff of the Army, heads a movement to remove Diem from power. The attempt fails and Hien is forced to leave the country. October 15. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee receives a Vietnam report from Senator Mike Mansfield. Based on a trip Senator Mansfield made to Vietnam, the report is strongly pro-Diem. 1955. March. The United Nationalist Front made up of the Bin Xuyen, the Co Dai sect, the Hoi Hao sect, and others, forms a coalition against the Diem regime. October 23rd. The official results of a national referendum to decide whether the country should remain in an empire or become a republic give Diem 5,721,725 Votes, Baydai 60, 3007. 1956, March. A National Assembly is elected in South Vietnam. 1957, February 22, a student attempts to assassinate Diem at Ban Mi Thao. I-960, October. Red forces erupt on the high plateau and defeat the regular army. November 11, paratroopers revolt against the government of President Diem. 1962, March 2, planes of the Vietnamese Air Force strafe Diem's palace. 1963, January 2, Communist forces defeat the Vietnamese army at LP Bac. May 8, armored cars open fire on Buddhists in Hue. A series of crises starts. August, Henry Cabot Lodge becomes United States ambassador to South Vietnam. October, the United States cuts sharply its aid to South Vietnam. November 1, the final military revolt against the Diem regime begins. Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother, Ngo Dinh Nu, are forced to flee the palace. November 2, in the early morning the palace falls to rebel forces. Later, Nu and Diem are arrested and then assassinated while being transported to Army headquarters in Saigon. The article by Mr. Rose listed above is a review of 6 books on Vietnam. Vietnam Diary by Richard Tregaskis. The Two Vietnams by Bernard Fall. Communism in North Vietnam by Patrick J. Honey, The Furtive War. The United States in Vietnam and Laos by Wilfred G. Burchett. Southeast Asia, Problems of United States Policy by William Henderson, and Southeast Asia in U.S. Policy by Russell H. Fifield. Burchett is an Australian communist who has spent some time living with the Viet Minh in North Vietnam. The New York Times, February 12, 1965, gave a report on another Burchett book that is nothing more nor less than anti-American propaganda. The report is as follows. Viet Cong by a Friend, a book about the Viet Cong forces that operate in South Vietnam, written by Wilfred G. Burchett, the Moscow correspondent of a number of communist newspapers, will be published at the end of the month by International Publishers Associates of New York. It is Vietnam, Dark Tunnel to Disaster, the story from the inside. The publishers explain that Mr. Burchett's book is an account of what he saw and learned during 6 months with the liberation forces in South Vietnam. An article by Mr. Burchett telling of his experiences with the Viet Cong appeared in a Soviet military weekly in December 1963. The article by Mr. Sachs, listed above, is quite simply a whitewash of the communist Viet Minh. At the date of this writing, Mr. Sachs is a professor at Brandeis University, Waltham, Massachusetts. About the author, Hilaire du Berrier was the first white child born in the little town his pioneer parents founded on the banks of a stream called Louse Creek in North Dakota. He studied in Minnesota, went to Layton School of Art in Milwaukee for a semester, then to Northwestern University School of Journalism in Chicago for a term. At the age of 20, he was barnstorming with a flying circus. In 1931, he went to Paris to spend, he thought, 3 months with his uncle, a former South Dakota congressman, then appointed commissioner to the United States participation in the French colonial exposition. This was the beginning of a life of adventure that was to lead him into the trouble spots of the world and was to prevent his return to America until 16 years later. When it became obvious that Mussolini intended to invade Ethiopia, du Berrier bought a ticket to Addis Ababa to offer his services to Emperor Haile Selassie. The long-awaited material never arrived, and du Berrier ended up as a war correspondent for Central News Agency of London. It was as a prisoner of the Italians that he entered Addis Ababa on May 5, 1936, in the second automobile in the Italian advance guard's column. French friends got him out of Addis Ababa and down to the coastal port of Djibouti on a French train. There du Berrier worked for a month with the disheartened Ethiopian consul Lui and Ardu Masai, who later became the son-in-law of Haile Selassie and viceroy of Eritrea. When the Civil War began in Spain, Du Berrier was in Romania trying unsuccessfully to sell airplanes for Koolhoven Aircraft of Rotterdam. Viewing the Franco revolt as a step toward restoration of the monarchy in Spain, Du Berrier dropped everything and boarded a train for camp. There he asked the advice of Colonel Clifford Harmon, a pro-Franco-American, donor of the Harmon Trophy, and founder of the International League of Aviators. Armed with a letter from Harmon to General Orgaz, Franco's chief of staff in Tetuan, Du Berrier set off for his rendezvous in Tangiers with Franco agent Don Cesar Alba. But he met only frustration. Italians were powerful in Franco's air force, and Du Berrier was on their blacklist for having helped Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. Back to Paris, he went to knock on the door of Franco's unofficial ambassador, the Marquis Quignon de Lyon, who, as it turned out, could do nothing for him. He then went to England and with a friend from Ethiopia, RAF pilot Olaf de Wet, later sentenced to death by the Germans, pestered Franco's London representative, the Marquis de Portago, with requests that they be sent to Franco's front. De Portago could do nothing for them either. Determined to see the Spanish Civil War from the inside, de Wet went to the Spanish Loyalist embassy in London and signed himself up as a pursuit pilot at $1.00 per month and expenses $15.00 for each plane he shot down, and $10.00 payable to anyone he wished in the event he was killed. And, said the Spanish official, we'll give you £20 sterling $100 for each recruit you can bring us. Not till a year later did Du Berrier learn that his pal had sold him to the Loyalists for the equivalent of $100. On November 2, 1936, the two arrived in Madrid, where Franco's troops were sitting in the suburbs. In the dead of the night with three other pilots, de Wet and Du Berrier were driven in a commandeered car through the closing pincers of Franco's advance. Their first stop was Albacete, but the planes they were to fly had been destroyed on the ground, so the tired carload of pilots pushed on to the naval airbase at San Javier, near the Army Air Force base of Los Alcazar. After a check out at Los Alcazares, Du Berrier was assigned to a pursuit group in Alicante, and de Wet was sent to Barcelona. When the one-month contract expired, the problem of getting out presented itself. After a week of stalling over safe conduct papers and travel permits, Du Berrier was sent to the new Air Ministry in Valencia. Meanwhile, communist reports from Paris had informed the Loyalist government that Du Berrier was an anti-communist. Accordingly, one of the Valencia groups that was making arrests on its own and executing prisoners without notifying the central government arrested Du Berrier at 8:30 a.m. on November 10, 1936, and took him to an interrogation center. Not until Senor Pliny, the interpreter from the Air Ministry, arrived that afternoon at 4:45 with the papers that saved him, did Du Berrier learn that those sharing the bench with him during that day had been taken out and shot when their names were called. Colonel Alberto Bayo, who later trained Castro's guerrillas, was responsible for saving Du Berrier's life. The reason: Eleanor Roosevelt and other American liberals were doing a great deal for Loyalist Spain, and Bayo was determined not to risk alienating them by having an American executed. Bayo sheltered him in the Air Ministry that night and put him, under military guard, on a train bound for France the following morning. In Paris, Du Berrier went at once to military attaches Colonel Fuller and Major Waite in the American embassy, and gave them an account of the situation in Spain, the Americans serving there under assumed names, and the Russian material being used. Next, aided by Mr. P. Ralph Heinzen of United Press, Du Berrier wrote a series of articles on Moscow's direction of the Spanish Civil War. These articles were published in part by the Hearst Press in America, and were syndicated abroad by the French agency Opera Mundi. It was at the suggestion of Colonel Charles Sweeney that Du Berrier sailed for the Orient in mid-April 1937. "There is going to be a show out there," said Sweeney. "You go and see if you can get all of us in." By a show, Sweeney meant a war, and by all of us, He met the little group of adventurous flyers who sat with him in Paris bars and talked of past wars around the world. On the boat with Du Berrier was Admiral Le Bigot and his staff, who were on their way to assume command of the French Far East Fleet. Rear Admiral Petit was with them, as were replacements for the military command in Indochina, the French concession in Shanghai, and French forces in points north. By the time they tied up in Saigon 3 weeks later, Du Berrier had established such ties of friendship so that thereafter the fate of any French officer in Indochina was a matter of personal concern to him. During his short stay in Saigon, a visit that changed the course of his life, he became close friends with Lieutenant de Vaisseau Ponchardier, the aviator, aboard the flagship La Motte Piquet. Ponchardier was later to live in the swamps of Indochina in a deadly underground war against first the Japanese and later the Viet Minh. Lieutenant de Vaisseau de Riencourt, pilot of the hydroplane hoisted on the stern of the cruiser Le Primagay, was another friend. De Riencourt's murder by a Viet Minh sniper in December 1945 brought Du Berrier still deeper into opposition to America's arming of Ho Chi Minh, an opposition that was to cost Du Berrier both his job with Newsweek magazine and his position as a civilian Far East specialist with SSU, Strategic Services Unit, the organization that succeeded the OSS, Office of Strategic Services. In the years that followed, there were other visits to Indochina and the little enclave of Quang Kaoan, where Monsieur le Prévost represented France. Du Berrier flew out of Hankow for a time when the capital was moved, Milan. His friend, Colonel Vincent Schmidt, came in auto from Paris to join him in late 1937, and he was this Vincent Schmidt who, as commander of the then Colonel Chenal's 7th Volunteer Bombardment Squadron raided Formosa in what was once the first attack on Japanese territory. By April 1939, Du Berrier was back in Shanghai, playing a dangerous game of hide-and-seek with the Japanese, resting in one apartment for a time, moving to another when it began to get hot. He and his Chinese team lived in constant danger as they zigzagged back and forth between the Shanghai International Settlement and the French concession, carrying with them the underground radio which maintained contact between Free China and Chiang Kai-shek's agents in Shanghai. The 12e Bureau, as French military intelligence is called, was headed in China by Captain Jean Valluy, who later became Supreme Commander of NATO forces, Central Europe. Assisting him were Captains Domuel and Mingent, as numbers 2 and 3 respectively. Captain Valluy was called back to Francais for a stage at the War College, but Captains Domuel and Mingent continued to protect and warn Du Berrier in his dangerous game. It was Mingent who, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, went over the roofs of apartments in a shabby quarter off Bubbling Well Road and removed from Du Berrier's apartment the transmitter and receiver, boxes of stick cordite for boiling down into gelatinous cordite, bottles of distilled water, nitric acid, glycerine, and other material used in the assembling of time bombs to be used against Japanese shipping. Most of the Americans trapped in Shanghai were businessmen. Du Berrier alone had contacts with the French military. Already he had started writing articles for America on the Japanese invasion of Indochina and massacre of the French officers who held up the Japanese advance at Dandong and Lance. Not content to sit in Shanghai and wait to be rescued, Du Berrier threw in with the network being formed by Captain Mingent as a unit of the French resistance. Réseau Mingent, as it was called, was later to operate between China and a French base in Indochina. It rescued many a downed American flyer in what was often a neck-and-neck race with the Japanese. To Mingant it brought the American Freedom Medal, to Du Berrier, nothing but trouble. He was arrested just before dawn in his Shanghai hideout on November 5, 1942, as officers of the Imperial Japanese Kamputai, the torture specialists of the Japanese service, answerable only to the Japanese Emperor himself, led Du Berrier down the narrow stairs from his attic apartment. A Chinese furtively peered out of a doorway on the floor below. It was Mr. B.L.J. Yo, head of the Telecommunications Bureau for Anhui Province, the man for whom the Japanese Kamputai had been searching for 3 years. Along with some 200 other Allied nationals charged with espionage, Du Berrier was taken to a prison camp on Haiphong Road in Shanghai and lodged in what had been the barracks of the U.S. 4th Marines. 5 months later, at 8:30 a.m. on April 5, 1943, Kamputai officers took him to the torture center in the former British Union Jack Club. Et. There he was interrogated, clubbed, and given the dreaded water treatment. When he was not in the torture room, he was kept in a 5-by-8 wooden cage with 6 other prisoners. On learning that Du Berrier was in the torture center on Myburg Road, Captain Mingant and his men figured the game was up, and with each day that passed, their fears increased that Du Berrier would break and confess. But he did not, and with the time thus gained, Mingant was able eventually to move south into Indochina. Du Berrier finally was moved to the makeshift hospital in Haiphong Road Camp late on the night of April 23rd. Dr. T. B. Sell. Dunn, the American doctor in the camp, prescribed a special diet of milk and eggs, which had to be bought on the black market, to build him up after the 18 days in the torture house. When the war was over, Mr. Louis Thompson, head of the finance office of the Department of State, refused Mr. Du Berrier a passport until he could repay the State Department $516 for food furnished him while a prisoner in Haiphong Road Camp. Du Berrier was one of 5 Americans who were held as hostages by the Japanese and refused a place on the exchange list when Americans who had been trapped in the Orient were exchanged for Japanese nationals held in America. VJ Day found Du Berrier with some 250 other prisoners, held as human shields in the largest Japanese ammunition dump in China, at Fengtai, 18 miles out of Peking, while awaiting transportation to Japan. There, an OSS parachute team led by Major Ray Nichols of Mississippi and Major Gustav Krause of Pasadena, California, liberated Du Berrier about the time one of their men named John Birch was killed by the communists only a few miles away. Through Pierre de Beaumont, a secretary in the French embassy, Du Berrier got word to the American team that the Japanese were concealing 4 surviving members of the Doolittle Raiders in pits in Peking. This was the beginning of Du Berrier's period of employ as a civilian with OSS and his back-to-the-wall opposition to the USS enthusiastic support of Ho Chi Minh, an opposition that was eventually to cost him his job. Du Berrier's next job was with Newsweek magazine. At the time, Harold R.R. Isaacs was head of Newsweek's Far East desk, but he had referred to Chiang Kai-shek as an SOB, and consequently was barred from China. Since he could not enter China, Isaacs was lauding Ho Chi Minh and heaping invectives on the French in Saigon, Hanoi, and Haiphong through his regular reports to Newsweek, and through his freelance articles for Harper's. Meanwhile, Du Berrier's old friend Valley, by this time a general and commander of French forces in Indochina, was greeted by gunfire from the Chinese warlord Lu Han when the transports bearing his troops neared Haiphong. Isaacs was for Ho Chi Minh in the showdown that followed, and Du Berrier was for General Valley. What happened next, therefore, was no surprise. Du Berrier received a telegram from Newsweek's home office stating that Mr. Robert Shapland would arrive aboard the Marine Phoenix to take over the Shanghai bureau. It was at this time that du Berrier began amassing his files on every actor on the Indochina scene to emerge from anonymity. Most of his information he learned from the actors themselves. He has estimated that with the same amount of money, time, and effort applied in the field of medicine, he could have become a surgeon. On January 7, 1947, du Berrier returned to his native America after a 16-year absence. He had $200 when he arrived in San Francisco. An army of young Americans was being dumped on the employment market, and he could neither get a job nor sell the articles that he wrote during the next 6 years. Also, his passport was still blocked until he could pay for the food he ate in a Japanese prison camp. At last, early in 1954, du Berrier's passport was temporarily unblocked on his promise that he would pay his bill when he was able. Later, the State Department threatened to withdraw it again, and in 1957, the bill was paid by Mr. Fred Champion of Los Angeles, giving du Berrier mobility once more. War was raging in Indochina, and du Berrier began making plans to return there. Mingant, by then a colonel, was back in Paris with a group that was planning to arm a Chinese force and turn over a sector of the front to General Li Sung-jian. General Li was the warlord of Guangdong province, who for a time had been president of Nationalist China. The French would underwrite JJ, arm him, and back him as far as the frontier of his old province, where his name was still magic. If he could snowball his forces and reconquer the Chinese mainland, the French would wish him well. Du Berrier was the intermediary between the army group in Paris and Li Sung-jian, who was in exile in New York. Dien Bien Phu fell before du Berrier could reach Paris, but his files on Indochina continued to swell. While Premier Laniel fell and Pierre Mendès France concluded the long-drawn-out negotiations in Geneva. Du Berrier was paid by the wealthy man in Los Angeles for his letter reports which editors constantly rejected, but which time after time proved to be correct. Ngo Dinh Diem was named Premier of South Vietnam, and his brother Ravoist became his agent in Europe. Meanwhile, a favorite of the powerful Madame Tran Van Chuan became ambassador to France and rival of Loyen in a deadly struggle for power and money. In April 1955, a call came for du Berrier from Loyen's office. "Will you be able to fly to Washington tonight?" asked the voice at the other end of the wire. Du Berrier did not leave that night, but he did leave the following night as aide to the deputy ambassador who was being dispatched by Zhuan Jian on a mission to undermine Ambassador Lawton Collins. 2.5 months later, du Berrier accompanied the Vietnamese mission to the Big Four conference in Geneva. As du Berrier's personal files continued to swell, storage room in his friends' homes began to diminish. In January of 1956, du Berrier began to perceive his mistake in helping thwart General Lawton Collins' recommendations that America dump the NGO Dins. The rumor has been circulated that du Berrier was dropped by Diem, and consequently was out for revenge in his withdrawing of support for Diem. Nothing could be further from the truth. It should be clear to anyone, even vaguely familiar with the vanity of dictators and the methods of public relations hucksters that they had du Berrier been interested in a high living. He could have become a rich man, feeding the insatiable Diem and his American press glowing stories of Uri Fei man's miracles in South Vietnam. Instead, because the market for honest reports was limited to one or two small publications in America, Du Berrier and Mrs. Doris A. Parks of Los Angeles launched their H.Y. Du Bay Reports, a private intelligence letter for the American who buys newspapers and news magazines and in them gets propaganda in lieu of news. One might say that this book began when Japanese officers confined Du Berrier's French friends to their quarters in Dang Dong and Lanson on the eve of World War II and threw hand grenades in on them. It was spurred on when valiant young de Riencourt was shot down in December 1945 by a Viet Minh sniper as de Riencourt was bathing in a river. The day an OSS major threw aside a report from Du Berrier on General Philip E. Yo Gallagher's transporting of Ho Chi Minh's protégé to Shanghai, where this protégé incited a revolt among French troops from Indochina. This book was given another push. "The French are bitching again," was the major's only comment. In his pocket was a gold cigarette case engraved, "To my good friend Major B from Ho Chi Minh Show." The Yunes. First, Chapter 1 of this book was actually drafted the day after a foreign service employee in the Seoul American jail embassy in Ho Paris boasted that he would get Du Berrier's passport because of a Du Berrier article published in the Beijing Economic Council letter of December 1, 1957, published by the National Economic Council of New York. When Du Berrier's passport renewal was blocked in the spring of 1959, and he learned of the smear file compiled against him, the necessity of making this book both complete and unassailable became a holy mission.